The auction started at 9:30, and by 9:45, Abigail Whitmore already knew she was going to do something people would talk about for weeks. Not because she planned it that way. She never planned things that way. She simply saw the cage sitting at the far left corner of Harmon Pruitt's yard, behind the good livestock, behind the grain sacks, and the used harnesses, and the box of bent nails someone was actually trying to sell. And inside that cage were 9 of the most pathetic-looking chickens she had ever laid eyes on. One had a bad leg, held up off the ground at an awkward angle, the foot curled in on itself. 2 were missing significant patches of feathers along their necks and backs, skin showing pink and raw underneath. Another sat apart from the others with its eyes half closed, breathing in a way that didn't sound quite right. The remaining 5 looked thin, not starved, but the kind of thin that comes from months of not enough. Not enough feed, not enough space, not enough care. They were a mess. The whole lot of them. Abigail stood there looking at them for a long time. "You interested in those?" asked a voice beside her. She turned. It was Dale Pruitt, Harmon's youngest boy, maybe 16, standing with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Pa's selling them off cheap. No one's going to bid on them." "What happened to them?" Dale shrugged. "Winter, mostly. We lost 3 others. Those 9 made it, but they ain't right. Pa says it costs more to feed 'em than you'd get back." Abigail looked at the cage again. The hen with the bad leg was trying to stand straighter, as if aware she was being evaluated. There was something almost dignified about it, which was a strange thing to think about a chicken, but Abigail thought it anyway. "What's the opening bid?" Dale blinked. 50 cents for all 9. She had $3.11 to her name, tucked in a small cloth purse that she kept pressed against her hip inside her coat pocket, because the pocket had a hole in it and she couldn't afford to lose what was in that purse. $3.11 was what stood between her and a problem she hadn't figured out yet. She bought the chickens for 60 cents, which was the only other bid, placed by Tom Hadley, who immediately dropped out when she raised him a dime, because Tom Hadley was not a man who spent 60 cents on 9 broken hens when he could use that money on tobacco. The crowd wasn't large, maybe 30, 40 people, but they were paying attention by then. Word traveled fast at auctions. Abigail Whitmore, who everyone in Hollow Ridge knew as the large young woman who lived in that small room above Marin Dix's laundry, had just paid good money for animals that belonged in the ground. She heard it start while she was signing the receipt. A low murmur first, and then actual laughter, not hidden or polite, the kind people allowed themselves when they thought the target of it wouldn't mind or couldn't hear. "Someone ought to tell her those birds are already half dead." "Maybe she figures they're the same." That one came from somewhere behind her left shoulder. She didn't turn around to find out who said it. She had learned a long time ago that turning around didn't help. It only gave people the satisfaction of knowing their words had found the mark. She pressed the receipt into her coat pocket, picked up the cage handle with both hands. The thing was heavier than it looked, and started walking toward the road. Hollow Ridge was not a cruel town exactly. It was a struggling one, and there is a difference, though sometimes the line between them gets worn thin by enough hard winters and not enough money. The town sat at the edge of the foothills, hemmed in on the north by the mountain range that locals called the Black Wall, and on the south by the high plains that stretched flat and pale all the way to the horizon. It had a general store, a feed store, a livery, a saloon, a doctor's office that doubled as a dentist's office, and approximately 340 people who all knew each other's business whether they wanted to or not. Abigail had arrived in Hollow Ridge 14 months ago, following a vague promise from her aunt that there was work to be had and a place to stay. The work had materialized. She'd spent most of those 14 months taking in laundry alongside Marin Dix, who was a fair employer if not a warm one. The place to stay had turned out to be a small room that was more closet than room, with a window that faced a wall. It was dry and it was hers, and she tried to be grateful for it. What she had not expected was the town itself, the way it looked at her. She was 23 years old, broad-shouldered and full-figured in a way that people in Hollow Ridge seemed to feel entitled to comment on. With dark hair she kept pinned back because she didn't have time for it otherwise, and brown eyes that her mother had once called serious. She moved through the world efficiently, taking up the space she needed and no more. And somehow this seemed to bother people, both the space and the efficiency. She wasn't from here. That was part of it. She didn't have family connections stretching back 2 generations. She didn't have a husband or a father in town. She wasn't pretty in the way the town seemed to prefer, small and light and easy to overlook. She was large and direct, and occasionally said things that people weren't expecting. And the combination of all these qualities had earned her a particular kind of reputation in Hollow Ridge. Not disliked exactly, not liked either. Noticed in the wrong way, talked about in the wrong tone. The kind of woman people told stories about rather than to. The chicken incident, she suspected, was going to become one of those stories. She was halfway down the road when she heard footsteps behind her, heavier and more deliberate than the usual passing traffic. She didn't slow down, but she adjusted her grip on the cage. "You need help with that?" She stopped. The man standing behind her was tall, genuinely tall, not the kind of tall that men often imagine themselves to be. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, with the build of someone who worked outdoors for a living and the look of someone who'd rather not be talking to a stranger. His coat was good quality, but old. His hat was pulled down against the thin October wind. He had dark eyes and a face that was not unfriendly exactly, but not open either. Guarded was the word that came to her immediately, like a door that was closed but not locked. She had seen him before. In town, occasionally, always alone, always moving as if he had somewhere specific to be and no interest in being delayed. She didn't know his name. "I'm fine," she said. He looked at the cage. The chickens had shifted during her walk, and the whole thing was listing to the left. The hen with the bad leg was making a sound, not quite distressed, but not comfortable. "You're not fine," he said. "That cage is off balance, and you're compensating wrong. You'll throw your back out before you get to the road end." She looked at him for a moment. "You watched me walk the whole way here? I was behind you. Hard to miss." He said it without any apparent embarrassment. "I'm going the same direction. I'll carry it to the end of the road." It was a practical offer, stated in a practical way, and Abigail was a practical person. She stepped aside and let him take the cage, watching how he adjusted his grip immediately, evening the weight. They walked in silence for a moment. "You bought those at auction," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Why?" She considered the question seriously, the way she tended to consider things. "Because no one else was going to, and I think they're not as far gone as people assume." He glanced at the cage. "The one sitting apart has a respiratory infection. I've seen it in flocks before. Treatable, but you have to catch it early." She looked at him sideways. "You know chickens." "I know livestock." He paused. "Ronan Blackwell. I run the Blackwell Ranch up at the Ridge." She'd heard the name. Most people in Hollow Ridge had opinions about Ronan Blackwell, that he'd gone strange since his wife passed, that the ranch was going to ruin because he wouldn't hire enough help, that he was the kind of man who didn't welcome company and made that clear. The opinions were delivered with a mixture of sympathy and judgment, the way people talked about someone they'd decided was a lost cause. "Abigail Whitmore," she said. "I do laundry." "I know who you are." She wasn't sure what to make of that, so she didn't try. They reached the end of the road. He set the cage down carefully, making sure it was level. "What are you going to do with them?" he asked. "Nurse them back, see what they're capable of." "And then?" "I haven't decided that part yet." He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling of being assessed. Not the way men sometimes looked at her, with that particular mix of dismissal and something worse, but as if he was trying to work out a problem, as if she was a variable in an equation he was running. "I need someone at the ranch," he said. "For the kitchen, mostly. And other work. Whatever needs doing." He paused. "I had a woman before Ruth. She left when the season turned. I haven't replaced her." Abigail absorbed this. "You're offering me a job." "I'm saying the position is open." "Based on what?" "You've known me for 10 minutes. Something shifted in his expression, just slightly. "You spent your last money on something everyone else said was worthless because you thought you could fix it. I need someone at a ranch that everyone else says is going under because they think it can't be fixed." He picked up his hat, adjusted it. "Seems like a reasonable match." She stood on the road in the October wind with a cage of half-dead chickens at her feet and $3.11, minus the 60 cents, in her pocket. She had a room above a laundry that wasn't warm enough, and a job that barely covered her rent, and a town that had just spent a morning laughing at her. "What does it pay?" she asked. He named a figure. It was more than she was making at the laundry. She looked down at the chickens. The hen with the bad leg looked back at her. There was something almost expectant in the bird's expression, though Abigail was aware she was probably projecting. "When do I start?" she said. "Well." Maren Dix was not pleased. She made this clear in the particular way of someone who has decided to be dignified about their displeasure, which meant she said all the right things. "I understand. Of course it's your choice. I wish you well," while making absolutely certain that Abigail felt the weight of every word. "Blackwell Ranch," Maren said, folding a sheet with precise, slightly aggressive movements. "You know what people say about that place?" "People say a lot of things," Abigail said, packing her second bag. She didn't own enough to fill it. "They say he let it fall apart after Eleanor died. They say the men up there are rough company. They say—" Maren paused, as if deciding how direct to be. "They say he's difficult. Most worthwhile things are." Abigail closed the bag. She turned to look at Maren, who had the look of someone who had been trying to say something important and hadn't quite gotten there. "I appreciate you giving me work when I needed it, Maren. I mean that." Maren set down the sheet. For a moment, she looked less like an employer and more like a woman who was genuinely uncertain. "You're sure about this?" "No," Abigail said honestly, "but I'm going anyway." She left the next morning, before the town was fully awake, which suited her fine. She'd borrowed a cart from Dale Pruitt. She'd do his sister's laundry for a month in exchange. And she loaded the chicken cage in the back along with her 2 bags and a small crate of things she'd bought with the remaining $2.41. Dried herbs she knew could help with respiratory illness in birds, some grain, a tin of lard for the cracked skin around the hen's injured foot. The rest she'd figure out. The road up to the ridge took most of the morning. It was not an easy road. Narrow in places, steep in others, the kind that required the horse to pick its footing carefully and the driver to pay attention. Abigail had grown up in hill country, which helped. She knew how to read the land. The Blackwell Ranch revealed itself gradually, the way mountain properties tended to. First the fencing came into view, then the outer pasture, then the outbuildings, and finally the main house, a large structure that had clearly been built by someone with ambition and then maintained by someone without quite enough time or help. The bones were good. The surface was showing wear in a dozen places. The barn roof had a low spot that was going to be a problem before spring. One of the pasture fence lines sagged badly on the north end. The kitchen garden was visible from the road, and it was a sorry-looking thing, dry and mostly gone to seed. Ronan was in the yard when she arrived. He watched her pull the cart in without coming to help, which she noted but didn't take offense at. She climbed down herself and led the horse to the fence rail. "You made it," he said. "Did you think I wouldn't?" He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, but it moved in that direction. "I wasn't sure." "Which direction were you uncertain about? Whether I'd come or whether I'd manage the road?" "Both," he said, and she respected the honesty. He introduced her to the ranch hands that afternoon. There were 4 of them. Walt, who was the oldest and most established, a lean, weathered man in his 50s who said nothing and watched everything. Curtis and Pete, brothers who were similar enough in appearance that Abigail kept confusing them for the first 2 days. And a young man named Eli who was maybe 19 and had the look of someone who'd come up to the ridge because there was nowhere else to go. None of them were hostile exactly, but none of them were welcoming either. She was an outsider, she was a woman, and she was large. All 3 of these things were being assessed simultaneously. She could see it happening in real time, the way men's faces do the math of a new person and arrive at a verdict before she's said 10 words. "Ronan says you're taking over the kitchen," Curtis said. He was the more talkative of the brothers. "Ruth left it in a state." "What kind of state?" "A bad one," Pete said. This was accurate. The kitchen was worse than she'd expected. Not dirty, exactly, but disorganized in a way that had clearly been building for some time. Things were stored in the wrong places. What food there was had been used in ways that were not particularly efficient, and there was a persistent smell underneath the wood smoke that she identified within about 10 minutes as a mouse problem. The pantry shelves were depleted. The stove needed cleaning. The window above the basin was cracked and letting in cold air. She stood in the middle of it and made a mental inventory, and then she went back outside to get her chickens settled in the broken-down coop beside the barn, and then she came back and got to work. The first week was the hardest. Not because the work was beyond her, what she had worked hard her whole life and was not frightened of it, but because hard work in a place where no one wants you there is a different kind of effort than hard work in a place where you belong. Every meal she cooked was eaten in a particular silence that she couldn't quite read. Every repair she made, the cracked window, the loose pantry shelf, the mouse trap set precisely and then checked each morning, was noticed but not acknowledged. Walt watched her the most. He'd come into the kitchen in the evening sometimes and pour himself a cup of coffee and stand near the door, not talking, not helping, just watching. She found this more interesting than troubling, eventually. He reminded her of a dog she'd known once that had been treated poorly and had to decide slowly whether new people were safe. The chickens were her one comfort. She'd set them up in the broken-down coop with extra straw and water, and she spent time with them in the mornings and evenings, checking the sick hen's breathing, treating the injured foot with the lard, ensuring the thin ones were eating. She talked to them, which she was aware looked peculiar but couldn't bring herself to stop. The sick hen, whom she'd begun privately calling Mabel because she had a Mabel quality about her, serious and a little offended by everything, was improving. The breathing was better by the 4th day. By the 8th day, she was standing straighter. Ronan saw her with his chickens one morning from across the yard. He didn't say anything, just watched for a moment and then moved on. She wasn't sure what he thought about it. She found out that evening at dinner. The ranch hands were at the table and she brought out a soup she'd made from the last of the dried beans and some herbs from her own supplies. And Ronan came in last, which was his habit, and sat at the head of the table. After a minute of eating, he said, "The injured one's foot looks better." She looked up. "The Lord's helping. She'll walk properly in another week, I think." Curtis glanced between them. "You checking on chickens, Ronan?" "I walked past the coop," Ronan said flatly, and went back to his soup. It was a small thing. It probably meant nothing. But Abigail found herself thinking about it later, lying in her room, a real room this time, with a window that faced the mountain, and she thought that it was possible Ronan Blackwell noticed more than he let on. Tuts. The valley came into focus slowly, the way landscapes do when you're new to a place and have to learn to read it. Hollow Ridge sat at the center of a valley ringed by the Blackwell Range on one side and lower hills on the other, with 3 other small ranches and a handful of homesteads spread across the middle distance. The road that came up to the ridge connected the Blackwell property to the valley below, and occasionally Abigail would see riders passing, supply runs mostly, sometimes neighbors making the social calls that were the valley's version of news distribution. She began to understand the valley's shape through these encounters and through what she heard in the kitchen. The ranch hands talked when they forgot she was listening, and she had learned early to be the kind of person other people forgot was listening. Silas Voss's name came up in these conversations the way a rock outcropping comes up on a mountain road. You knew it was there, you planned around it, but you didn't stop to examine it too closely. He ran a supply company out of the valley's commercial center, 15 miles south, and he had interests in the bank, the grain operation, and various arrangements with the railroad that no one seemed to fully understand. He was the kind of man who had made himself necessary to a region the way a river made itself necessary to a plain. Everyone depended on him, and no one was quite comfortable about it. Ronan owed him money. This was the one piece of information that had the texture of a real problem, not just background noise. She picked it up in fragments. An overheard comment from Walt, a particular tension in Ronan's jaw when a supply rider came up from the valley bearing a document that Ronan read and then put in his coat pocket without mentioning. She didn't ask directly. She filed it and kept watching. What she could see clearly was what Silas Voss was doing with the valley's smaller operations. Pete mentioned it one evening, that Amos Freely's farm had gone under in the spring, that the Calhoun family had sold off their south pasture at a price that nobody thought was fair, that the Hendersons had stopped coming to town at all since they'd had that business with the bank. Each story on its own was just the kind of hard luck that happened in frontier country. Put together, they had a shape. She thought about this while she worked, and while she nursed her chickens back to health, and while she slowly rebuilt the kitchen into something that actually functioned. She thought about shapes, the shape of a valley being squeezed, the shape of a man who'd built his power on other people's desperation, the shape of a debt that kept growing no matter how carefully you tried to manage it. She didn't know yet what she was going to do about it. She only knew that she was going to do something. The first real test came on a Thursday, 5 weeks in, When Ronan rode down to the valley for supplies and came back with less than he'd gone for, and a quietness about him that was different from his usual quiet, tighter, like a fence line under too much pressure. She was in the kitchen when he came in, and she looked up from the bread she was working and saw his face and went back to the bread without saying anything, because she was learning him, learning that the wrong kind of attention at the wrong moment made him close up rather than open. He sat at the table. She put coffee in front of him. She went back to the bread. After a while, he said, Voss shorted the supply order, said the credit wasn't enough to cover the full amount. She pressed the heels of her hands into the dough. By how much? Third of what I ordered. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. He's been doing this. Incrementally. Each time I go down, something's been adjusted. The prices go up. The credit terms change. He stopped. Looked at the coffee. It's a squeeze. I know, she said. He looked up at her. She hadn't realized she'd said it out loud until she heard the words and saw his expression. Not offense exactly, but surprise. You know, he repeated. I've been listening, she said simply. And I've been watching the accounts you leave on the desk when you forget to put them away. I don't think the debt is what he's saying it is. I think there are charges in there that don't have a proper record behind them. The silence that followed was the kind that could have gone in several directions. She waited, hands still pressed into the dough, not looking at him. You've been looking at my accounts, he said, and his voice was perfectly level, which meant she couldn't tell anything from it. I found them on the desk, she said. They were open. I sat down and looked at them because numbers bother me when they don't add up. Another silence, longer this time. Do they add up? He said finally. Not in a way that makes sense, she said. There are fees on there that I can't find receipts for, and the interest calculations look wrong. Not wrong like a mistake, wrong like a choice. He set down the coffee. He looked at her for a long time. Abigail, he said, and it was the first time he'd used her name directly, she realized. Before it had always been a general address, a space where her name would have been if he'd been the kind of man who used names. What exactly are you saying? She pulled the dough into shape and set it aside to rest. She wiped her hands on her apron and turned to face him fully. I'm saying I think Silas Voss has been cooking the books on your account for years. I'm saying the debt you think you owe is not the debt you actually owe. And I'm saying... She paused, because this next part was the part she hadn't quite worked out all the way yet, but she knew the direction of it. I'm saying that if he's doing it to you, he's probably doing it to everyone in this valley, and that means there's a record somewhere, and records can be found. Ronan was quiet for a long time. Outside, one of the horses in the near pasture made a sound, and the wind shifted, and somewhere across the yard Eli was doing something that involved a hammer. You're thinking about how to fight him, Ronan said. I'm thinking about how to win, Abigail said. She turned back to the stove. Her hands were shaking slightly, she noticed. Not from fear, from the particular tension of having said something that couldn't be unsaid. Behind her, she heard Ronan pick up his coffee cup. She heard him take a slow drink. Finish the bread, he said, and his voice was different than it had been at the start of the conversation. Still contained, still measured, but something underneath it had shifted. A loosening of something that had been held too long. We can talk about the rest tonight. Outside, Mabel the chicken was strutting across the yard on a foot that had healed straight and clean. Nobody who'd seen her in that cage at Harmon Pruitt's auction would have recognized her. Abigail turned the bread out of the bowl and thought about 9 broken things that everyone said were worthless, and about a valley full of people who'd stopped believing they could fight back. And she felt, for the first time since she'd walked into Hollow Ridge with 2 bags and high hopes, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because it was comfortable. It wasn't. Not because she'd found easy acceptance. She hadn't. But because there was a problem here that had a shape, and she was beginning to understand the shape, and understanding was always the first step toward the only thing that had ever mattered to her, fixing what was broken, making it whole again, whatever it cost. The bread came out well that night. Not perfect. The bottom crust was a shade darker than she wanted because she'd been distracted. But good. Solid. The kind of bread that filled a room with a smell that made men sit down without being asked. They ate in the usual silence, but it was a different quality of silence than the weeks before. Something had shifted in the kitchen that afternoon when she'd told Ronan what she'd seen in the numbers. And the shift was the kind that doesn't announce itself, but that everyone present can feel. The way you feel a change in the weather before you can see it in the sky. Walt looked at her once, near the end of the meal. Just once, a measuring look, and then he went back to his plate. She filed that away too. After the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, Ronan spread the account ledger on the kitchen table, and Abigail sat across from him with a second lamp pulled close, and they went through it together. It took 2 hours. She was methodical about it, working column by column, and Ronan was better with the specifics than she'd expected. He knew dates, remembered deliveries, could tell her exactly which supply runs had produced what, which seasons had been shorted, and which had been fair. The problem was that his memory and the written record did not match up in ways that were too consistent to be clerical error. "This fee here," she said, pointing to an entry from 18 months back. "Supply handling, $32. Do you remember being charged for handling?" Ronan leaned over the ledger, his jaw tightened. "No, I remember that run. It was a standard order, nothing unusual. And here, interest adjustment, 4% quarterly. When did the rate change?" "It didn't." He sat back. "It was supposed to be 2.5. "Well, it changed." She tapped the page. "Somewhere between when you shook hands on the original terms and when this entry got written down, somebody decided it was 4%. He was quiet. She watched him process it, not with panic, but with the grinding recognition of a man who'd suspected something was wrong for a long time and had been hoping he was mistaken. "How much?" he said. She'd done the rough calculation twice already. "If we strip out the fees without proper receipts and recalculate at the agreed interest rate, I think the real number is somewhere around 40% less than what he's claiming." Ronan put both hands flat on the table. He stared at them. 40%, he said, roughly. "I'd need to see the original loan documents to be sure." "Do you have them?" He didn't answer right away. He got up and went to the back room. His office, such as it was, a small space off the main hallway that she'd never been inside, and came back a few minutes later with a tin box. He set it on the table and opened it and started sorting through the contents, and she waited. He found the document. She read it carefully, twice. Then she set it beside the ledger and looked at both of them together and felt something settle into place in her chest. Not quite anger and not quite satisfaction, but the particular clarity that comes from finally seeing the full shape of a problem. "He changed the terms," she said. "The original agreement is right here, 2.5%. Payment schedule is clearly outlined. He's been billing you against terms you never agreed to." Ronan looked at the two documents side by side. "I'm not a stupid man," he said, and his voice had a roughness to it that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite something else. "I know you're not. I should have caught this." "He's had years to make it complicated," she said. "And men like Silas Voss count on the fact that people who are working hard and trying to keep things running don't have time to sit down and do this kind of accounting. That's not stupidity. That's him being deliberately predatory." Ronan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You sound like you've seen this before." She hadn't expected that. She looked down at the documents and thought about how much to say. "My father," she said finally. "Different situation, same shape." She didn't elaborate, and he didn't push her, and she was grateful for both. They sat there a while longer in the lamplight, the documents between them, the mountain quiet and dark outside. "I need the original receipts," she said. "Every supply run you can find a record of. And if you've got correspondence from Voss, letters, any written agreements, I want to see those too." "What are you going to do with them?" "Build a picture," she said. "One that holds up when someone looks at it hard." The receipts took her 3 days to sort through, working in the evenings after the kitchen was closed and the hands had gone to bed. Ronan left her to it, which she appreciated. He wasn't the kind of man who hovered, and she wasn't the kind of woman who worked well being watched. The daytime work of the ranch continued without pause. There was always too much of it, and not quite enough hands to do it properly. And the season turning toward November meant things were becoming more urgent. The roof on the barn was now a genuine problem. She brought it up at dinner one evening, which was apparently not the kind of thing a kitchen woman was supposed to do, judging by the look Curtis gave Pete. "The low spot on the north side," she said. "If we get a heavy snow in the next few weeks before someone patches it, there's a real chance of collapse in that corner. That's where the grain is stored." Ronan looked at her. "I know about the roof." I'm sure you do. I'm saying it's moved from a future problem to a present one. She passed the bread around. I can go up and patch it if Walt will hold the ladder. I've done it before. This produced a different quality of silence than usual. She watched it move around the table, the slight recalibration in each man's expression as he decided what to do with that particular piece of information. Walt said from his end of the table, "I'll hold the ladder." Curtis looked at Walt, Pete looked at Curtis. Eli looked at nobody, which was his default. They did the roof on a Saturday, Abigail and Walt, working through a cold, clear morning that smelled like snow coming. Walt was not a talkative man, but he was a steady one, and he held the ladder without any of the theatrical protectiveness that she'd been braced for. He simply held it, level and firm, and when she asked for tools, he handed them up without comment. From the barn roof, she could see most of the valley, the Blackwell pastures, the far mountain line, and in the distance, along the lower road, the faint movement of a supply wagon she recognized after a moment as coming from the direction of Voss's operation. "How often does Voss send someone up this way?" she asked, not looking away from the distant wagon. Walt, below her, was quiet for a moment. "More than he used to, past few months. Watching the place." "That's my read." She turned back to the patching. The damage section wasn't as bad as she'd feared. A weak seam in the wood that had let water in, which had let rot start, but it hadn't gone deep yet. Caught in time. She worked quickly and efficiently, sealing the seam and reinforcing the boards on either side, and when she climbed back down, Walt looked at the work and then looked at her and said, "Good patch." From Walt, she was coming to understand this was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. The chickens had become a point of low-level fascination for the ranch, though nobody wanted to admit it openly. Mabel, fully recovered, had established herself as the clear authority among the 9 birds, which had surprised Abigail. She'd expected the largest and most aggressive hen to take that position, but instead it was Mabel, the one who'd nearly died, who commanded the flock through some quality of steadiness that the others recognized and respected. She never made much noise. She was simply always positioned correctly, always aware of where everyone else was, always the first to find food and the last to retreat. Abigail had started letting them out of the coop into the yard during daylight hours, and they'd taken to following her when she moved between buildings, not because she fed them on the move, but because she was apparently their reference point. She'd come around a corner to find all 9 of them in a loose cluster behind her, going about their business while staying within her orbit. "You've got a flock following you," Eli said one afternoon, with the tone of a young man who's found something funny but isn't sure he's allowed to say so. "I've noticed," Abigail said. "Is that normal? For chickens that nearly died and came back? I think they remember who helped." She looked at him. He was not a bad kid, just young in the way that comes from having had to grow up fast, which paradoxically leaves certain gaps. "Where are you from, Eli?" He looked surprised to be asked. "East of here, small place, doesn't matter." "Family?" "Not much of one." He said it flat, without self-pity, which told her more than a longer answer would have. She nodded. She went back to what she was doing, and he went back to what he'd been doing, but something had shifted slightly, a small degree of opening, and she filed that away too. She was filing a lot of things in those weeks. It was how she thought, in layers and connections, in patterns that built slowly until they were solid enough to act on. The accounting was one layer. The valley's situation was another. The people on the ranch, Walt's watchfulness, Curtis's mouth, Pete's quieter sharpness, Eli's careful blankness, were another layer still, and Ronan was a layer she was working on very slowly, because he was more complicated than he appeared, and because getting it wrong would matter in ways that getting the other layers wrong would not. He'd lost his wife 2 years ago, Eleanor Blackwell. She died in February, which was the worst time for anything to happen in mountain country, because February had a particular bleakness to it that could break even stable people. She'd heard it in fragments, gathered from the way the hands talked around the subject rather than about it. The way Eleanor came up in conversation as a reference point, something that had shaped the ranch and everyone on it, and then the way Ronan had gone quiet afterward, and stayed quiet, in a way that had started to feel permanent. She wasn't trying to fix that. She was clear on this with herself. She wasn't here to fix Ronan Blackwell's grief, and she wasn't going to make the error of confusing her own loneliness with something that resembled feeling for him. She was here because there was work to do, and the work was good and she was good at it. She told herself this regularly, with the particular firmness of someone who suspects they might need to keep hearing it. The first crack in the wall of the ranch hand's reserve came from an unexpected direction, which was Curtis's wife. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, driving her own wagon up from the valley with 2 kids in the back and a problem she'd driven an hour to address. Her name was Dottie, and she was a small, sharp-featured woman with the energy of someone who runs on barely enough sleep and has made her peace with that. She found Abigail in the kitchen garden, which was now actually productive. Not spectacular, but no longer the sorry scrub of dead plants it had been in October. Abigail had spent the latter part of that month and all of November working it back to something useful, planting late-season greens and rebuilding the soil with what she could source from the barn and the surrounding land. "You're the one who revived this garden?" Dottie said, looking at it with an expression that was hard to read. "Working on it," Abigail said. "Curtis said you were good with plants." Dottie turned and looked at her directly. She had the manner of a woman who didn't have time for indirect approaches and had stopped pretending otherwise some years back. "He doesn't say it like a compliment. He says it like it's a complaint. But you know how men report things." Abigail smiled despite herself. "I do." Dottie had a problem with her kitchen garden, too. A blight that had taken her bean crop and was spreading to the squash. She'd tried everything she knew, and it wasn't working. She'd driven up to the Blackwell place because Curtis had mentioned in passing that the woman in the kitchen up there seemed to know what she was doing, and Dottie, being a practical woman, had acted on the information. They spent 2 hours talking through it. The blight's pattern, the soil conditions, what she'd tried, and what might work differently. Abigail gave her 3 specific things to do, in order, with the reasoning behind each one, and Dottie listened with the attention of someone who actually retains information. At some point, the 2 kids climbed down from the wagon and found Mabel and the other hens in the yard, and the resulting chaos was the kind that involves a lot of running and shrieking and no actual harm to anyone. And Abigail and Dottie stood and watched it, and Dottie said, "Those are the chickens from Harmon Pruitt's auction." Yes, Dottie looked at them. The 9 birds, fully recovered now, feathers grown back, Mabel strutting among the children with magnificent composure. "I was at that auction," she said. "I remember people laughing." Abigail said nothing. "They look good now," Dottie said. "They were always going to look good. They just needed the right conditions." Dottie looked at her for a moment. Something in her expression shifted, the particular recalibration of a woman updating her assessment of another woman. "You want to come for supper sometime? I'll send word with Curtis." "I'd like that," Abigail said. It was not a dramatic moment. It was not a turning point by any measurable standard. But something had started there in the garden with the chickens loose in the yard and 2 children trying and failing to catch Mabel, and Abigail recognized it for what it was, the beginning of something that would matter. The accounts were taking shape. By mid-November, she had sorted every receipt she could find into chronological order, flagged every discrepancy, and compiled what amounted to a parallel ledger that showed what Ronan actually owed against what Silas Voss was claiming he owed. The gap was significant. Not 40%, as she'd initially estimated, but closer to a third, which was still a number large enough to change everything. She showed Ronan on a Sunday evening when the hands were occupied elsewhere. He studied the parallel columns for a long time without speaking. She'd organized it carefully, clearly, the way she used to organize her father's records when she was young, and he was too exhausted from working to do it himself. Laid out so that even someone who hadn't spent weeks in the numbers could follow the logic of it. "If this is right," he said, "it's right. If I brought this to someone, you'd need a witness," she said, "not just a document. Documents can be challenged. You'd need people who dealt with Voss directly and got the same treatment." "Bo a chicken," she paused. "I think there are people in this valley who have parallel stories, people who took out credit with Voss and found the terms changed on them, people who sold land because the debt was supposed to be one thing and became another." She thought of the Calhoun family, the Hendersons, the others Pete had mentioned at the dinner table months ago. "I think if you asked around carefully, you'd find them." "People are scared of Voss," Ronan said. "He's got his hands in too many things." "I know." She looked at the ledger. "But scared people can be reached if they know they're not the only one." Ronan leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. He had the look of a man who was recalculating, not whether to do something, but how large the thing he was about to commit to actually was. "What made you decide to do all this?" he said. "You didn't have to. You were hired to cook and manage the house." She thought about it seriously, the way she did when the answer wasn't immediate. "It bothered me," she said finally. "The shape of it. What he's been doing to you, to this valley. It has a particular shape, the kind where the people who get hurt most are the ones who can least afford to lose." She set down her pen. "That shape has always bothered me, since I was a kid. When I see something with that shape, I have to do something about it or I can't sleep." "You haven't been sleeping well anyway," Ronan said. "I hear you moving around at night sometimes." She was surprised enough that she looked up. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the ledger, but there was something in the set of his face that was different from his usual contained expression. More present. "I'm always like that," she said. "My brain doesn't stop." "No," he said quietly. "I don't suppose it does." The lamp between them made the room smaller than it was. The circle of light containing just the table and the documents and the two of them, and outside the November wind was doing something steady and cold against the windows. It was not a comfortable moment exactly, but it was not uncomfortable either. It was the particular intimacy of two people who have agreed to tackle something difficult together and are only now fully feeling the weight of that agreement. "I'll talk to Walt," Ronan said finally. "He's been here longest. He knows who in the valley has had trouble with Voss." "Good." She began gathering the documents into order. "And Ronan, don't go to anyone who's too close to Voss's operation. We need people who have reason to be honest, not people who might feel they need to protect themselves by telling him what we're doing." Ronan looked at her. "You think he'd find out? I think a man who controls what he controls has eyes in places people don't expect." She tucked the ledger into the tin box. "We have to be careful about the order we do things. It matters." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "For what it's worth, what you've done here. The kitchen, the accounts, the roof." He stopped, tried again. "It wasn't what I expected." She looked at him. He was not a man who said things like that easily. She could see the effort of it in his face. "What did you expect?" she asked. He almost smiled again. "I don't know, something easier to categorize." She picked up the tin box. "I'll take that as a compliment." "It was meant as one," he said. "Yeah." December arrived with cold that had teeth to it, the kind of cold that woke you at night and tested the drafts in your room's walls. Abigail had found an extra blanket folded in the back of the linen closet, old, worn in patches, but functional, and she added her coat on the worst nights, because she was not going to complain about cold to a man who'd offered her more than anyone else in this territory had. The kitchen was warm, at least. She kept the stove going from before dawn until after the last meal, and the kitchen had become, without anyone formally deciding this, the gathering place of the ranch. The hands drifted through at odd hours. Coffee in the afternoon, something to eat before heading out on a cold morning. The particular aimlessness that cold weather produced in men who were used to being occupied outdoors. She let them come. She didn't encourage excessive conversation, but she didn't chase them out either. And slowly, the way ice softens around the edges before it breaks, the dynamics shifted. Walt started talking. Not a lot. Walt would never be a lot, but incrementally. He told her things about the ranch that she needed to know. Which fence lines were seasonal problems, which horses had quirks, the particular behavior of the upper pasture in deep winter when the snowmelt came down wrong. Practical knowledge, shared practically, which was the only way Walt knew how to share anything, and Abigail received it in the same spirit. Curtis started including her in conversations rather than pausing them when she came near. This was a bigger shift than it might sound. Curtis was a talker, and being included in his talking meant being included in the version of the ranch's social life that he managed, which was extensive. Pete, who was quieter and more watchful than his brother, did something smaller but that she valued more. He started asking her opinion on things. Not important things initially, small things, but asking, which meant he decided her opinion was worth having. And Eli. Eli was the one she thought about most. He'd grown up hard and was trying to figure out what kind of man to be, and the ranch was the first stable ground he'd had in some time, which meant he was protective of it in a way the others weren't. protective in the way of someone who knows what it's like to not have it. She saw this in him and was careful with it. She didn't push. She let him come at his own pace. He started appearing in the kitchen in the evenings with small repairs. A loose hinge on the pantry door, a cabinet handle that had worked itself free, a crack in one of the floorboards near the stove that was letting cold air up. He fixed these things without being asked and without explaining himself, and she thanked him straightforwardly, and he nodded and left. One evening in December, while he was fixing the floorboard and she was making the last of the day's preparations, he said, without looking up from his work, "You know what people in town say about you?" "I have a general sense," she said. "They think you're strange, for buying those chickens, for coming up here." "People often think the choices that don't fit their expectations are strange," she said. He worked on the board for a moment. "My mother made a choice like that once. Everyone told her it was wrong. Turned out she was the only one who was right." He paused. "She died before anything came of it, but she was still right." Abigail set down what she was doing and looked at him. "I'm sorry about your mother," she said. "Yeah." He drove the last nail. "I'm just saying, people laughing at something doesn't mean it's wrong." "No," she said. "It doesn't." He packed up his tools and left, and she stood in the kitchen for a moment thinking about what it costs a young man to say something like that, and how it almost always means he needs someone to say something back. She was going to make sure, when the time came, that Eli had a reason to stay. Walt brought her the first name in the third week of December, a man named George Paulson, who'd had a small cattle operation on the valley's east side until 2 years ago, when a loan from Voss's bank had swallowed the whole thing. He was living with his brother-in-law now, the cattle gone, the land sold, and according to Walt, he was quiet about the whole business in the particular way of a man who's angry but doesn't see what good anger will do. "Would he talk to me?" Abigail asked. Walt considered this. "Maybe. If he thought there was a point to it." "There's a point to it," she said. "I need him to understand that. You'd have to go down to the valley, to his brother-in-law's place." She thought about this. "Is it the kind of errand I could do without making Voss's people wonder what I'm doing? You'd need a reason for being in the valley that looks ordinary." Walt looked at her levelly. "Dottie Curtis has been wanting help with that blight situation. Follow-up visit would look ordinary enough." She blinked at him. "You've been thinking about this." "I've been thinking about it for a long time," Walt said, and his voice had the quality of something that had been held down for years. "Before you got here, I've been thinking about it since the Henderson place sold, since Calhoun lost his south pasture." He looked out the kitchen window. "I just didn't know how." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Now we know how." He looked at her. It was the longest direct look he'd given her since she arrived, and what was in it was not warmth exactly. Walt was not a warm man in expression, but something that functioned like it. Trust, maybe, or the beginning of it. "Yeah," he said. "Now we know how." Outside, Mabel was at the kitchen door again, which she did in the late afternoons when the cold came on, standing at the threshold with the patient expectation of a hen who knew she was always going to be let in eventually. Abigail went and opened the door, and Mabel walked in with the composure of someone who has survived the worst and emerged with excellent posture. Abigail stood at the open door for a moment, feeling the cold and looking out at the valley below the ridge, the valley that Silas Voss thought he owned, the valley that was going to find out otherwise. She closed the door. There was work to do. George Paulson lived in a small room at the back of his brother-in-law's property, and when Abigail arrived with Dottie on a Wednesday morning in late December, he came to the door looking like a man who had gotten used to not expecting much from visitors. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, heavy-set in the way of someone who had once been physically powerful and was now carrying that frame on less activity and more grief. His hands were the hands of a cattleman, large, calloused, the kind that remembered what work felt like, even when there was none of it to do. He looked at Abigail with the careful blankness of someone who had learned that people arriving with questions usually made things worse. "Walt Gruber sent word," he said. Not a greeting exactly. More of an acknowledgement that this had been arranged. "He did," Abigail said. "I appreciate you being willing to talk." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Dottie, who gave him a small nod that clearly carried some weight of prior acquaintance. He stepped back from the door. They sat in the kitchen, which smelled of his brother-in-law's family, children, and whatever they'd had for breakfast, and the particular lived-in quality of a house where there were too many people and not quite enough space. George's sister brought coffee and then disappeared with the tact of someone who understood that this conversation needed room. "What do you want to know?" George said. He had his hands around his cup and he was looking at the table. "I want to know about your loan," Abigail said, "from Voss's bank. The original terms and what happened to them." Something moved across his face. "What good does that do? The land's gone, the cattle are gone, 2 years gone." "It might do a great deal of good," she said, "for people who haven't lost everything yet. For Ronan Blackwell, who's about to if nothing changes." She paused. "And possibly for you. If what happened to you is what I think happened to you, then you were defrauded. That doesn't disappear because time has passed." George looked up from the table. "You're saying he cheated me. I'm saying I think he did. I'm saying I need you to tell me what you remember so I can see if it matches what I've found in the Blackwell accounts." He was quiet for a while. Outside, somewhere in the main part of the house, a child knocked something over and there was a brief commotion and then quiet again. George turned his cup around in his hands. Then he started talking. It took over an hour. He was not an organized storyteller, so he circled back, corrected himself, stopped sometimes to work out the sequence of things, but he was thorough, and what he described had exactly the shape she'd been expecting. A loan taken out in good faith to expand the herd. Terms agreed on verbally and then committed to paper by Voss's man in the bank, a clerk named Hester, who George had trusted because he'd known the family. Interest rate that started reasonable and that George had believed was fixed. A payment schedule that seemed workable given projected cattle prices. And then, gradually, the terms changing. A fee here, an adjustment there. The interest climbing in ways that the documents Voss produced somehow justified, though George couldn't follow the justification no matter how many times it was explained to him. A bad season that put him behind, and suddenly Voss was at his door with papers showing a default amount that was nearly double what George had calculated on his own. "I told him those numbers were wrong," George said. "I told him straight. He sat right across from me, and he was very calm, very reasonable. Said the documents were clear, said I must have misunderstood the original agreement." He stopped. I started thinking maybe I had. Maybe I wasn't as sharp as I thought. My wife had passed the year before, and I wasn't in the best shape. He looked at his hands. Maybe that's why he came at me when he did. I don't know. Abigail said, "Do you have any of the original paperwork? The loan agreement? Any correspondence?" "Some. My brother-in-law kept a box of things when we left. He thought it might matter someday." George looked at her. "Nobody ever came asking before." "I'm asking now." He got the box. It took some time to find in the back of a closet, and when he brought it out and opened it, the papers inside were creased and slightly damp from storage, but intact. Abigail spread them on the kitchen table and compared them against the copies she'd brought from Ronan's tin box, and within 20 minutes she had found 3 specific points where the pattern repeated exactly. The same types of fees, the same interest adjustment structure, the same language used in the documents that Voss produced to justify terms the borrower hadn't agreed to. It wasn't coincidence. It was a system. "George," she said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to think about it honestly. If there was a legal proceeding or a formal hearing, would you be willing to testify to what you've told me today?" The kitchen went quiet in a particular way. George looked at the document spread across his brother-in-law's table. His jaw worked. "Voss has got people," he said, "in the county seat, in the bank board. He's got—" He stopped. "I've got nothing. I'm living in my sister's house. If I stand up and say something and it doesn't work—" "I understand," Abigail said. "I'm not asking you to decide right now. I'm asking you to think about it." She began to gather the papers. "And I'm asking if I can make copies of your documents. For the record I'm building." He watched her gather the papers. Then he said, "There are others. You know that." "I'm starting to know it. Calhoun's boy, young Marcus, he's still in the valley, working for the feed store now. His family lost their south pasture, and he never believed the numbers, but he couldn't do anything about it alone." George paused. The Henderson family moved on. But before they left, Thomas Henderson told me he'd kept copies of everything, said someday it was going to matter. He looked at her directly for the first time with something other than wariness. You might be right that someday is now. The winter moved the way winters did in that country. Slowly, grinding, with occasional breaks in the cold that felt like mercy and were usually just the weather's way of gathering itself for the next effort. The ranch held together, the roof patch held, the kitchen garden slept under frost, and Abigail made plans for what she'd plant when the ground came back. She visited George Paulson twice more in January. She found Marcus Calhoun at the feed store on a Tuesday morning and talked to him for 30 minutes between customers, just enough to establish that he remembered everything about his family's loan and had, in fact, kept the original paperwork in a manner that suggested he'd been waiting for exactly this conversation. She sent a letter to the address George gave her for Thomas Henderson, explaining carefully, without naming Ronan or making it sound larger than she could prove yet, what she was trying to do. She kept detailed notes on everything, organized in a way that Ronan could follow when she showed it to him, which she did once a week on Sunday evenings. These meetings had become the most important part of the week for both of them, she thought, though for different reasons. For Ronan, they were the only times he allowed himself to believe that the ranch might survive what was coming. For Abigail, they were something less definable. The hours when the work felt most real, when she could see the shape of it clearly and feel the progress of it like solid ground under her feet. He asked good questions. She'd learned this about him over the months, that beneath the contained exterior was a mind that worked carefully and caught things quickly. He didn't say much during these Sunday meetings, but the questions he asked were precise, and they pushed her to sharpen her thinking. How many people does Voss need to have working for him for this to hold together? He asked one Sunday in late January after she'd shown him the parallel documents from George's loan. She thought about it. The clerk? The one George mentioned, Hester. Someone with access to the loan documents after signing, who could make the adjustments? Maybe one more person in the bank to approve the revised numbers without asking questions. Beyond that, she paused. Beyond that, he doesn't need employees exactly. He just needs people who are scared enough not to look too hard. Most of the valley, Ronan said. Most of the valley, she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. And when Voss finds out what you're doing, not if, when. When he finds out. He looked at her. What does he do? This was the question she'd been turning over for weeks. He calls in whatever leverage he has. He'll try to discredit the evidence first, say it's fabricated or misunderstood. Then he'll try to discredit the people presenting it. She met Ronan's eyes. Including me. You personally. I'm the easiest target. I'm not from here. I don't have family connections. I've already given the town reasons to laugh at me. She said it without bitterness, just as a fact. He'll use whatever he can find. Ronan's expression did something complicated. And you're still doing this. The alternative is, you lose the ranch and he does this to the next person and the next one after that. She closed her notebook. So yes, I'm still doing it. He looked at her for a long moment. I want you to understand something, he said slowly, as if he was working out the phrasing while speaking. Eleanor, my wife, she had a quality that I've only seen in maybe 2 or 3 people in my life. She understood what things cost, and she did them anyway. Not carelessly. She knew the cost exactly, and she paid it. He stopped, looked at the table. I'm not comparing. I'm just saying I recognize it. The lamp flickered once and steadied. Thank you, Abigail said, and she meant it simply, without layering anything on top of it. It was Walt who first heard about the feast. He came into the kitchen on a Thursday morning in late February with a particular set to his shoulders that she'd learned meant something worth paying attention to, and he poured his coffee and stood by the door and said, Voss is throwing a summer gathering for the whole valley. Announcement went up in the general store. Abigail looked up from the bread she was making. What kind of gathering? A feast. Public meal. Table set up on the Voss property south of town. Walt drank his coffee. He does it every few years. It's a demonstration of what he's got, of what he provides. And this year he's decided to do it now. This year he's decided to do it in June. Walt looked at her. About 6 weeks after the hearing date you've been working toward. The timing was not an accident, and they both knew it. Abigail pressed the heels of her hands into the dough and thought. He knows, she said, or he suspects, which amounts to the same thing. Walt set down his cup. He's going to try to use the feast, build his reputation up before anyone can tear it down, pack the valley with people who've eaten his food and felt his hospitality and aren't going to want to believe anything bad about a man who fed them that well. Has he invited specific people? Open invitation. The whole valley. Walt paused. There'll be a program, speeches. He'll make a presentation, probably about what he's done for the region, how he's supported local business, the kind of thing that sounds generous and is actually a preemptive defense, Abigail said. Yeah. She shaped the bread and set it aside and stood at the kitchen counter thinking. She could feel the problem from multiple angles simultaneously. The way Voss was moving to reinforce his position before she could challenge it. The way a large public gathering would shift the mood of the valley in his favor. The way any evidence she presented at a hearing after a successful feast would feel, to ordinary people, like an attack on a man who had just been generous to them. The bread needed to rest. She covered it and turned around. I'm going to that feast, she said. Walt looked at her. It's his ground. I know. He controls everything about it. What's served, who speaks, what the tone is. You'd be walking into a situation he's designed. Yes. She moved to the window and looked out at the yard. Mabel was in her usual position near the kitchen door, overseeing the morning activities of the flock with characteristic authority. Walt, what does the valley know about the Blackwell chickens? Walt blinked at the apparent change of subject. What? Our chickens. Do people in the valley know about them? People know you bought 9 sick ones at Harmon Pruitt's and brought them up here. It was a story for a while. He paused. Dottie talks. In a good way. She's told people the hens recovered. Abigail turned from the window. I want to bring food to the feast. Our food. From this ranch. She watched Walt's face. I want to bring dishes made from those chickens. Eggs from those chickens, meat if we need it, everything that came from what people called worthless. And I want to put it on those tables. Walt was quiet for a while. You're going to go into his feast with your own food. I'm going to walk into his feast and feed the valley with the things they laughed at. She said it clearly, without drama. And when people ask where the food came from, I'm going to tell them. He won't allow it. He's made it an open invitation. He's made a point of it being for the whole valley. If he refuses me, if he refuses food brought by a woman from a local ranch, he's going to have to explain why, publicly, in front of everyone he's trying to impress. She paused. He'll let me in. He'll think he can manage it. Walt looked at her for a long time. And when he tries to manage it, then I'll deal with that when it happens. Tut. The spring came on gradually, the way springs do in mountain country. Tentative at first, taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back through March, then committing in April in a way that felt almost aggressive after the winter's long restraint. The kitchen garden woke up. Abigail planted it seriously this time, with a plan and with seeds she'd sourced from Dottie and from 2 other valley women she'd connected with over the winter months through Dottie's network. The ranch was functioning better than it had in years, if Ronan's expression was anything to go by. The accounts were in order. The supplies were being managed more carefully. The hands were working as something closer to a unit, not without friction, because Curtis and Pete had friction built into them as siblings, and Eli still had his quiet mornings when he was somewhere else in his head, but with a coherence that hadn't been there in October. Ronan noticed. He said so one evening in April, standing in the doorway of the kitchen, which was his way of being present without committing to being present. The men are different, he said. Abigail was reviewing seed counts. Different how? Better? He looked uncomfortable with the word, like he'd committed to it and wasn't sure he stood behind it fully. Something settled. People settle when they know what they're working toward. She looked up. They needed to know the ranch had a future. Once that was clear, once there was a plan, it changed things. You change things. We're changing things, she said, and meant it. He looked at her for a moment with that particular expression she'd come to recognize, the one where he was present in a way that was different from his usual careful reserve, where the distance he kept had shortened by some unmeasured amount. Then he looked away. The Hendersons wrote back, he said, to your letter. She set down the seed list. And? Thomas Henderson is willing to talk. He has documents. He says, Ronan pulled a letter from his coat pocket and read from it directly. I have kept every piece of paper related to that loan for 2 years waiting for someone to ask about it, because I always believed what happened to us was not legal, and I always intended to say so when the time was right. He folded the letter. He'll come back to the valley for a hearing. Abigail felt something release in her chest, a tension she'd been carrying since December without fully acknowledging it. 3 witnesses. 3 sets of parallel documents. 3 people who had been through the same systematic fraud at Silas Voss's hands and could stand up and say so. It was enough. Maybe not to destroy Voss completely, but enough to prove the pattern, enough to challenge the debt, enough to save the ranch. I need to send letters, she said, to the county clerk's office, to find out what the process is for a formal hearing on a debt dispute. I already did, Ronan said. She looked at him. Last week, he said, while you were in the valley visiting Dottie. He had the slight expression of a man who isn't sure he's overstepped. I know you've been managing most of this. I thought it was time I did something myself. Ronan, she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. What did they say? There's a process. It requires a formal complaint lodged with the county, documentation of the disputed amounts, and at least 1 witness corroborating the claim. A hearing can be scheduled within 60 days. He paused. I filed the complaint. She stared at him. The hearing is set for May 15th, he said, which is 6 weeks before Voss's feast, she said. Yes. He met her eyes. He'll know by then that the complaint was filed. He'll know what's coming. That's why he's throwing the feast, she said, working it through. He already knows. Someone in the county clerk's office told him, or he has someone watching the filings. She stood up straighter. He's known for weeks, maybe. Everything he's doing, the feast, the timing, it's all response to this. Probably, Ronan said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment, recalibrating. This changed some of the sequence she'd planned. If Voss knew about the hearing, then the 6 weeks between May 15th and the feast were 6 weeks during which he would be working to undermine everything they'd built. He'd be talking to people. He'd be managing his version of the story. He'd be applying pressure to the witnesses they'd gathered, maybe without those witnesses even realizing it was happening. We need to move faster on some things, she said. I know. Ronan sat down at the table. Tell me what needs doing. What needed doing was this. She needed to talk to George Paulson and Marcus Calhoun directly, before Voss had a chance to reach them first. She needed Thomas Henderson to commit in writing, with specifics, to what he could testify. She needed the documents organized in a way that a county examiner could follow without prior knowledge of the accounting. And she needed to do all of this while the ranch continued to run, and the kitchen garden needed planting, and the ordinary work of ordinary days didn't stop to accommodate the larger emergency underneath it. She was tired in a way she didn't admit out loud. She slept less than she should have. Some mornings she lay in bed for the 10 minutes before she had to get up and just let herself feel the weight of what she was carrying, and then she got up and carried it anyway. Ronan brought her coffee one morning in early May, which he had never done before. He set it on the kitchen counter beside her without a word and went back out, and she looked at the cup for a moment before picking it up. And she thought that there were some things that couldn't be said directly between people who didn't quite have the language for them yet, and sometimes a cup of coffee had to do. She went to see George Paulson on the 5th of May, 10 days before the hearing. He opened the door and she could see immediately that something had happened, a tightness around his eyes, a particular flatness in his expression. Someone came to see you, she said. He stepped back from the door. She came in. He didn't sit. A man from Voss's operation, he said, 2 days ago. Very polite, very measured. He turned his cup around in his hands, a habit she recognized from their first meeting. He said he was just checking in, making sure everything was comfortable, that there weren't any misunderstandings about the bank's position on past accounts. His jaw tightened. He mentioned my sister's family, just in passing, how they were doing, how the children were getting on. Abigail felt something go cold and careful in her. A threat. Dressed up like a concern. George sat down. He never said a word that I could point to and call wrong. That's what gets me. He never said a thing that was directly, it was all implied, she said. Yes. He looked at her. What happens if I stand up at that hearing and it doesn't go the way you think? What happens to my sister's family? She sat down across from him, and she was honest with him, because he deserved honesty, and because she'd learned that people who'd been lied to by one side of a dispute were very sensitive to being given false comfort by the other. I can't promise you it goes perfectly, she said. I can tell you that the evidence is solid and that you won't be standing alone. George Paulson, Marcus Calhoun, Thomas Henderson. 3 witnesses, 3 parallel stories, 3 sets of documents. That's not one disgruntled man with a grudge. That's a pattern. She held his gaze. And I can tell you that if you don't stand up, Voss continues to do exactly what he did to you to every other family in this valley until there's nothing left to take, including whoever's next, including people your sister's children might grow up to be. Silence. The house around them made its small sounds. You're asking me to be brave, George said. I'm asking you to be brave for 10 minutes in a county hearing room, she said. What you built and then lost, you couldn't save that alone, but you can help save what's left for everyone else. He was quiet for a long time. All right, he said finally. He said it like it cost him something, because it did. All right, I'll be there. The hearing was scheduled for 9 in the morning, and by 8:30, the county clerk's building had more people outside it than a typical hearing ever attracted. Word had traveled, not through any direct action of Abigail's, but through the channels that small valleys use when something important is happening. The particular speed of information that moves through a community when people sense that something they've been waiting for is finally arriving. Marcus Calhoun was there, standing with his hat in his hands and a quiet intensity in his face. George Paulson had come, as he'd promised, with his brother-in-law standing silently behind him as a kind of anchor. Thomas Henderson had arrived the evening before, driven up from 2 counties south, looking older than his age and carrying a leather satchel that he held with both hands. Ronan stood beside Abigail outside the building. He was in his good coat, the one she'd seen him wear only once before. He was looking at the crowd with the expression of a man who hadn't fully believed until this moment that the crowd would be there. Silas Voss arrived at 5 minutes to 9 in a well-appointed wagon with 2 men accompanying him. He was in his late 50s, silver-haired, with the confident bearing of a man who had not lost a meaningful contest in a long time. He surveyed the crowd as he crossed the yard, and his gaze landed on Abigail and stayed there for a moment, the first direct look she'd ever had from him, and it told her everything she needed to know about how he intended to approach this. He smiled at her, a small, deliberate smile that said, I know exactly who you are and what you've got, and it won't be enough. She looked back at him without expression. She was carrying the document folder she'd assembled over months of evenings and winter mornings, organized, annotated, with the kind of detail that took patience to build and nerve to present. Ronan, standing beside her, said quietly, You all right? Yes, she said. And then, because it was true and seemed worth saying, Are you? He thought about it, which she appreciated. I don't know yet, he said. Fair, she said. They went inside. The hearing went for 4 hours, which was longer than expected. The county examiner was a methodical man named Garrett, who asked questions slowly and read everything before he commented on it, which Abigail appreciated because it meant the documentation was being taken seriously. Silas Voss's lawyer was smooth and experienced and attacked the evidence on 3 fronts. First, that the original loan documents had been properly agreed upon. Second, that any subsequent adjustments had been within the legal parameters of the contract. Third, that the witnesses were disgruntled former debtors with a financial interest in the outcome. The arguments were well constructed and delivered without any trace of uncertainty. Marcus Calhoun testified first. He was nervous. She could see it in his hands, but he was precise, and the documents he'd kept were exactly what he'd said they were. The original terms, in Voss's clerk's own hand, showing numbers that were different from what Voss later claimed. Thomas Henderson was steadier. He'd had 2 years to decide what he would say and how he would say it, and he said it clearly and without embellishment, which was more convincing than passion would have been. George Paulson was last. He sat across from the county examiner, and he was quiet for a moment before he began, and Abigail watched him find whatever he'd found when he'd set all right in his sister's kitchen. And then he talked, and what he said was unimpeachable because it was simply what had happened to him, stated plainly, without exaggeration. Voss's lawyer objected twice. Garrett overruled both times and asked George to continue. When it was done, the documents, the testimony, the parallel accounting she'd prepared, the county examiner asked for a recess to review the materials. He came back 40 minutes later. Garrett looked at the documentation spread before him, and then he looked at Silas Voss, and he said, in the careful language of a man who was being deliberately precise, that the interest calculations as presented in the Blackwell account did not reflect the terms of the original signed agreement, and that the discrepancy was of a magnitude and character that required formal investigation by the county bank board, and that pending that investigation, the current debt figure presented by Voss's company was not legally actionable. The foreclosure was suspended. Ronan, sitting beside her, let out a breath that she suspected he'd been holding for months. Voss, across the room, was still. His lawyer leaned to his ear and said something. Voss's expression didn't change, but his eyes found Abigail across the room, and what was in them was not the same easy confidence of the man who had smiled at her in the yard that morning. It was something harder, colder, the look of a man recalculating. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she gathered her documents because there was still a great deal of work left to do, and she had never been the kind of person who celebrated before the thing was actually finished. Outside in the afternoon light, George Paulson found her before she reached the wagon. He looked not happy exactly, because happiness was too simple for what had just happened, but lighter than she'd ever seen him, like something he'd been carrying had been distributed more fairly among more shoulders. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you," she said. "You did the hard part." He shook his head. "No, you did the hard part. The rest of us just showed up." She watched him go back to his brother-in-law. She stood in the yard for a moment in the thin spring sunlight. Walt appeared beside her. He was looking at the building they'd just left, at the dispersing crowd, at the wagon that was carrying Silas Voss back south with his lawyer. "He's not done," Walt said. "No," Abigail said. "He's not done." The feast was 6 weeks away, and Silas Voss was a man who did not lose contests gracefully. She climbed into the wagon. There was bread to make tonight, and a kitchen garden that needed checking, and 9 chickens waiting to be fed by someone they had decided was their reference point in an uncertain world. That, at least, was something she knew how to do. The 6 weeks between the hearing and the feast were the strangest of Abigail's time in the valley, because they had the surface texture of ordinary life and the undertow of something that hadn't finished yet. The ranch ran. The kitchen garden came into its own in late May, producing more than she'd projected. The soil work she'd done through the fall and winter paying out in the way that good preparation always eventually did, quietly and without ceremony. Mabel and the others were laying consistently now, enough that Abigail had begun selling eggs to Dottie and 2 other valley households, which was small money, but money that was hers, which felt different from wages in a way she hadn't entirely anticipated. The hands felt the change, too, felt that something had happened at that hearing and that the ranch was on different ground than it had been. Curtis was louder and more cheerful than usual, which was his way of processing relief. Pete was quieter and more focused, which was his. Walt moved through his days with the same economy as always, but with less of that background tension she'd read in him from the beginning, that sense of a man waiting for bad news he couldn't stop. Even Eli seemed lighter, less defended in the mornings, more likely to appear in the kitchen for conversation rather than repairs. But Voss was moving. She could feel it even when she couldn't see it. The first sign came from Dottie, who mentioned in passing during one of Abigail's valley visits that there was talk going around. Not specific talk, just the general kind. Whispers about the hearing, about who'd been involved, about Abigail herself. People repeating things, not always accurately, in the way that rumors work when someone with resources wants them to work. That she was an outsider who'd come from nowhere, that she had reasons of her own for stirring up trouble, that what she'd presented at the hearing was one-sided and the full picture was more complicated. "Who's saying it?" Abigail asked. Dottie looked uncomfortable. "Nobody specific, that's the thing. It's just in the air." "That means he's spreading it carefully, through people who don't know they're being used." Abigail thought about this. What are people making of it? Mixed, Dottie said honestly. Some people think it's fair. They've had their own troubles with Voss, and they're glad someone said something. But some people are cautious. Voss has done a lot of business in this valley. People don't like uncertainty. They don't like thinking that things they thought were settled might not be. They'd rather believe it's fine than deal with knowing it isn't. Most people would rather believe that, yes. Dottie looked at her. Are you still going to the feast? Yes. Dottie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'll be there too, in case that helps. It helped. She didn't say so as fully as she felt it, because Dottie was not a woman who needed effusive thanks and would have found it uncomfortable. But it helped. The second sign came from Marcus Calhoun, who sent a note via the feed store's delivery to the Ridge. Short, written in a hand that pressed hard into the paper the way anxious people's hands do. Someone came to talk to my employer. Don't know what was said. My employer hasn't said anything directly, but things feel different at work. I'm still in. But I thought you should know. She showed it to Ronan that evening. He read it twice. He's pressuring the witnesses, Ronan said. He's reminding them of what they stand to lose. She folded the note. He can't undo the hearing. The examiner's findings are in the county record. That's not going away. But if he can make the witnesses recant or make them scared enough that they're unreliable if there's a fuller investigation, then the bank board inquiry gets muddier, harder to prosecute. Can he make them recant? He can make them scared enough to want to. Whether they do depends on them. She paused. I need to go see Marcus. And George? George is holding. I talked to him last week, but I'll check in again before the feast. She was already running the sequence in her head. Who to see, in what order, what to say. The feast is in 3 weeks. Once we're past the feast, once he's tried his public move and it doesn't work, I think the energy shifts. He's spending a lot trying to manage this. That costs him. Ronan looked at her. You think he'll try something at the feast itself, beyond just using it for reputation management? He invited the whole valley to his property, she said. He controls the setting, the program, the crowd management. Yes, I think he'll try something. She met Ronan's eyes. Which is why I'm not going alone. He nodded slowly. I'm going with you. I know you are. She picked up the note. I'm also bringing the food. He looked at her with an expression that was partly exasperation and partly something that she had given up trying to name precisely. You're still set on that. A feast made from the chickens everyone laughed at, served at the table of the man who's been bleeding this valley dry. She set the note in her folder. Yes, I'm still set on that. She went to see Marcus Calhoun 2 days later. He was stocking shelves in the back of the feed store when she arrived, and he looked up when she came around the corner with the expression of a man who is relieved and alarmed in equal measure to see someone. You got my note, he said. I did. How are things with your employer? Marcus set down the sack he'd been holding. He was a young man, maybe 25, with a careful, guarded quality that reminded her a little of Ronan, the same habit of measuring before he spoke, the same sense of someone who'd had reasons to be careful for a long time. He asked me some questions about the hearing, whether I was certain about what I'd said. He paused. He was polite about it. Very polite. That's almost worse. Did he threaten your job directly? No, just questions. And then he moved on, and we haven't talked about it since. Marcus looked at the shelves. But I keep waiting. Marcus, she said, I need to ask you something directly. Are you going to hold? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I think about my father, what it did to him, losing that pasture. He never recovered from it, not fully. He died the year after, and I've always thought. He stopped, looked at his hands. I've always thought the loss was part of it, the particular kind of loss where something's taken from you and you can't make anyone understand that it was taken. You just have to carry it. He looked up. I'm not going to let him make that into nothing, what my father went through. I'm not recanting. She nodded. She didn't thank him in a way that would have made his decision feel small. She just said, Good. The record is solid. The hearing findings don't go away. He's trying to make you feel more isolated than you are. How many people are standing up? Enough, she said, and possibly more after the feast. His eyebrows moved. What happens at the feast? I'm not entirely sure yet, she said, but I'm going, and I'm bringing food, and I intend to let the valley see the full picture of what this valley has built for itself, without his help. Marcus looked at her for a moment. You're going to feed people with those chickens. The story had evidently traveled, as stories did. Among other things, she said, something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly, but the precursor to one. I'll be at the feast, he said. I'll bring my sister. She can cook. Tot. The third week of June arrived with heat that felt earned after the long winter, open and generous, the kind of summer that frontier country occasionally produced, as if making up for what it had taken. The Voss property south of town had been set up over several days, long tables arranged in the open field, a platform at the northern end for speeches, bunting in the valley colors that someone with an eye for these things had arranged carefully. Wagons were arriving from mid-morning, families with children, ranchers in their good clothes, townspeople who came more out of social obligation than any particular affection for Silas Voss. Abigail arrived at 10 o'clock in the morning with a wagon loaded with food that she and Dottie's neighbor Ruth had been preparing for 2 days. Ronan drove. Walt sat in the back with the covered dishes and said nothing, which was his version of solidarity. Eli had asked to come, and she'd said yes without hesitation. The food was as follows: 3 roasted hens, from the original 9, the ones whose recovery she had overseen through October and November, who had laid through the winter and into the spring, and who had, when the time came, given what they had to give. Eggs prepared 4 ways, the recipes drawn from what the kitchen garden had produced. Bread made with flour she'd ground from grain that Ronan had grown in the upper field, the variety that the valley's commercial mill had refused to buy 2 seasons ago on the grounds that it wasn't worth processing. Preserves from the garden, a soup built from vegetables and bones and thyme, the kind of thing that costs almost nothing and tastes like everything, because good soup is always an argument for patience. She had not dressed up. She was wearing her usual clothes, clean and pressed, but ordinary. She was not going to the feast as a performance. She was going as herself. Silas Voss was near the entrance when they arrived, talking to a group of men she recognized as local merchants. He saw her wagon. She watched him make the calculation, the brief pause, the decision about how to respond, and then he smiled and came toward them with his hands open and his manner expansive. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "and Ronan, I'm glad you came." The warmth in his voice was technically flawless. I didn't expect. His eyes moved to the back of the wagon, the covered dishes. "What is this?" "We brought food," Abigail said. "I thought since it's a community feast, the community should contribute to it." The calculation happened again behind his eyes. There were 30 people within earshot. He couldn't turn her away without an explanation, and any explanation he gave would be wrong in some direction. "Of course," he said. "We'd be honored to include it." He gestured toward one of the long tables, where his people were still arranging dishes. "Set it wherever there's room." "Thank you," she said pleasantly. She and Dottie and Ruth set up the food at the end of one of the center tables. Not hidden, not pushed aside, front and visible. She set a small folded card near each dish, written in her careful hand, describing what it was and where it came from. Eggs from the Blackwell Ranch. Hens recovered from the Pruitt auction. October last year. Bread from Blackwell upper field grain. The variety the commercial mill refused. She was not going to be subtle about this. Subtlety had its place, and this was not it. The feast was busy by midday. The valley had turned out in something close to its full capacity. She recognized faces she'd seen at the general store, at the feed store, at Harmon Pruitt's auction a lifetime ago. Children ran between the tables. Someone had set up a fiddle near the platform. The food, both Voss's contributions and her own, was being eaten, which meant that by mid-afternoon, without her doing anything further, people who had been eating Voss's food had also been eating hers, and the cards were being read, and conversations were starting. She heard them in fragments as she moved through the crowd. "Those are the chickens from the auction last fall." Somebody said she bought them for almost nothing. "Look at the card. Grain the mill wouldn't take." The fragments had the quality of people rearranging information they already had into a new configuration, which was exactly what she'd hoped for. Voss's program started at 2 o'clock. He stood on the platform with the comfortable authority of a man who had stood on platforms before. And he spoke about the valley, about what had been built here, about the importance of commerce and credit to frontier development, about the relationships he'd cultivated over decades with the families who worked this land. He was good at it. She had to acknowledge that. He had a manner that made people feel included in something larger than themselves, which was a genuine skill regardless of who wielded it. He spoke for 20 minutes. Then he thanked the valley for its trust and its business and its continued partnership. He did not mention the hearing. He did not mention Ronan. He did not mention her. He had decided, she could see, that the best approach was to make her irrelevant by not acknowledging her existence, which was a reasonable strategy that was about to become unavailable to him. Because when the polite applause finished and Voss stepped back from the platform, a voice from the crowd said, "Can I ask about that food at the center table?" It was Marcus Calhoun. He'd positioned himself well, toward the front, audible without shouting, the question framed as innocent curiosity. Voss looked at him. "What food is that?" "The eggs and bread and the roasted hens, with the cards on them." Marcus looked around at the crowd with the expression of a man who is genuinely curious and sharing that curiosity. "I was reading the cards. Says the chickens came from the Pruitt auction last fall, that the grain was the kind the commercial mill wouldn't buy." He looked at the platform. "Who brought that?" Abigail was standing at the edge of the crowd near the center table. The question had turned heads in her direction. She did not step forward dramatically. She simply said, at normal conversational volume, "I did. From the Blackwell Ranch." The crowd had the particular quality of a large group of people all deciding simultaneously what to pay attention to. She felt it shift. Voss spoke before she could continue. His voice was still pleasant, but the pleasantness had thinned. "Miss Whitmore has been working at the Blackwell property this past year. It's generous of her to contribute." He was trying to make her small, a servant who'd brought a dish to the table, nothing more. "The Blackwell Ranch has been going through a difficult—" "The ranch is fine," Ronan said. He'd come through the crowd to stand beside her. He had his hat in his hand and his jaw was set the way it got when he'd decided something. "The accounts are in order. The county examiner said so 3 weeks ago." A different kind of quiet went through the crowd. The hearing had not been a public event, but its results had traveled as results did. Some people here already knew the broad strokes. Others were hearing it for the first time, and their faces showed the recalibration of people encountering information they hadn't had before. Voss stepped down from the platform. He moved through the crowd toward them, and he did it slowly, which told her he was controlling the pace deliberately. When he reached her, he was still smiling, but the smile had changed into something that required more maintenance. "I think," he said, at a volume calibrated for the people immediately around them rather than the whole crowd, "that you and I should speak privately about what's being suggested here." "I'm not suggesting anything privately," Abigail said, at the same volume. "We're at a community feast. This is a community matter. Miss Whitmore." His voice dropped further, and what was underneath the pleasantness now was something harder, the bedrock under the topsoil. "You are a woman who arrived in this valley 14 months ago with nothing. You have no property here, no family, no history. What you're doing, what you've been building toward, is damaging to people who have been part of this community for decades." He paused. "I think you should consider very carefully what you actually know and what you only think you know." The people immediately around them had gone very still. She could feel the crowd's attention concentrated on this small space. She looked at him. She was aware that this was the moment, not the hearing. The hearing had been legal and procedural and removed from most people's daily lives. This was the moment that the valley would carry. Whatever happened in the next 60 seconds would be what people talked about for years. "I know," she said clearly, "that those chickens on the table came from an auction where people laughed at them and said they were worthless. I brought them to the Blackwell Ranch and I nursed them back, and they thrived, because the only thing actually wrong with them was that nobody had bothered to take proper care of them." Tookie. She kept her voice level and her eyes on his. "And I know that the debt you claim Ronan Blackwell owes you is not the debt he actually owes you, because I have read every receipt and every original agreement and every account record, and the numbers don't match the terms that were signed. And 3 other families in this valley will tell you the same thing happened to them." She let that sit for a moment. "I'm not suggesting anything," she said. "I'm saying what is true. And I'm saying it here because this valley deserves to hear it. The silence lasted several seconds, long enough to feel like a very long time. Then Silas Voss did something she had not entirely predicted. He looked at the crowd around him, the faces, the attention, the particular quality of a community that has just heard something it needed to hear. And he made a decision. Not a retreat. Something worse from her perspective. "Very well," he said, and now his voice was fully public again, carrying to the edges of the crowd. "Since we're being direct, the Blackwell account has been in arrears for 3 years. The hearing raised procedural questions about documentation, but let me be equally direct. The debt is real. The ranch property has been used as collateral on that debt since the beginning." He reached into his coat and produced a document. "And that collateral gives my company the legal right, under the terms of the original agreement, to file for possession of the property, which I am doing." He looked at Ronan. 30 days, Blackwell. The ranch needs to be cleared in 30 days or my lawyers begin the possession process." The crowd noise went up, not loud, but immediate, the sound of several hundred people all reacting simultaneously. Abigail heard Ronan beside her take a breath. She looked at the document in Voss's hand. She had not seen this specific document before, but she recognized the shape of it, the collateral clause, which was real, which she had seen referenced in Ronan's original loan paperwork. She had not fully explored that clause because she'd been focused on the debt amount itself, on the fraudulent interest calculations. She had known the collateral existed. She had not known he would use it as a separate instrument. This was what the hearing hadn't stopped. The examiner had suspended the debt figure as disputed. But the collateral agreement, if it was structured the way she feared it might be, didn't necessarily require the debt figure to be final. It could be triggered by a finding of arrears regardless of the disputed amount. She kept her face still. "Let me see that document," she said. Voss looked at her with the expression of a man who has just played the card he'd been holding back. "It's addressed to Mr. Blackwell." "Ronan," she said. Ronan took the document from Voss's outstretched hand. He handed it to Abigail without opening it. She opened it and read it, standing in the middle of a crowd of several hundred people, as quickly as she could while reading carefully. Her first reading confirmed her fear. Her second reading found something else. She read it a third time. Then she looked up. "This collateral clause," she said, and her voice was steady because she needed it to be, "specifies that it can only be triggered if the arrears are confirmed as valid by the county bank board." She looked at Voss. "Not the county examiner, the bank board, whose inquiry is currently ongoing." She turned the document so Ronan could see the relevant paragraph. "The hearing suspended the debt as disputed. The bank board inquiry hasn't concluded. This clause cannot be legally triggered while that inquiry is active." Morsim Patsati. The crowd was very quiet. Voss's lawyer, standing at the edge of the group, moved forward. She saw him, a different lawyer from the hearing, older, sharper looking. He said something to Voss in a low voice. Voss looked at the document, back at her. "You have 30 days, he said. But the certainty in his voice had shifted, just slightly, just enough for the people around them to notice the shift. "No," she said quietly. "We don't, not legally, not right now." She handed the document back to Ronan. "I'll have a legal analysis on your desk by next week, if you'd like to discuss it further." The feast broke up slowly after that, the way events do when the central drama has concluded and people need time to process what they've witnessed before they can go back to ordinary behavior. Food was still eaten. The fiddle played for another hour, but the crowd had a different quality for the remainder of the afternoon. People talking in smaller groups, more quietly, heads together. George Paulson found her near the wagon at the end of the afternoon. He'd been in the crowd for the confrontation. She'd seen him, but they hadn't spoken. Now he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something she'd have called liberation if she wasn't worried about being dramatic. "He tried to do the same thing to me," George said. "The collateral clause. That's how he took the cattle operation. He used the collateral even though the debt number was wrong. I didn't know enough to fight it." She looked at him. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't find the collateral angle until tonight. If I had—" "You were working with what you had," George said. He wasn't accusatory. He was just stating it. "Now you have more." He put his hat back on. "What do you need from me next?" She thought for a moment. I need to know if your original collateral agreement had the same language, the bank board confirmation clause. If it did, then what he did to you may not have been legal either. George was very still. If that's true, let's find out if it's true before we go anywhere with it, she said carefully. Bring the original paperwork. Can you come up to the ranch next week? Yes, he said. I'll be there. Ronan said almost nothing on the drive back. Eli sat in the back and was also quiet, in his particular way, which meant he was processing rather than absent. Walt drove the second part of the way when Ronan's hands went stiff on the reins. She'd seen it happen, the tension of the day cashing out in his body the way strain does when the performance is over. It was full dark when they reached the ridge. She unloaded the wagon with Eli's help, the dishes that had come back mostly empty, which was its own kind of answer about whether the valley had eaten the food they'd brought. When the wagon was unloaded and the others had gone in, Ronan was still in the yard. She went back out. He was standing by the fence looking at the pasture, which was invisible in the dark but was there in the way that familiar things are there, even when you can't see them. He still wants the ranch? Ronan said. Yes. The collateral clause, does what you said tonight actually hold? Or were you buying time? She was quiet for a moment because he deserved the honest version of this. It holds for now. The bank board inquiry being active does seem to prevent the clause from being triggered independently. But I need a proper legal read on that document, and I need it quickly, because if I'm wrong, if you're wrong, we have 30 days. Yes, so I need to not be wrong. She stood beside him at the fence. I also think, if George's collateral agreement has the same language, then what Voss did to him was also illegal. Not just the interest manipulation, the actual seizure of the cattle operation. She paused. That's a much larger legal problem for Voss than anything the hearing established. Ronan turned to look at her. In the dark, she could see the outline of him rather than the detail, but she knew his face well enough by now to read it without full light. You found that tonight, in the middle of a crowd reading a document for the first time. I was looking for something that didn't fit, she said. It's how I read things. He was quiet for a moment. Abigail. Yes. I need to say something, and I'm not good at saying things. I know you're not. Say it anyway. He was quiet for another moment. Not the uncomfortable kind of quiet. The kind where someone is finding the right words because they want to get it right. When I offered you a job last October, he said, I told myself I was being practical. The ranch needed someone. You seemed capable. The chickens were a sign of something I recognized, even if I couldn't name it then. He stopped. But I think I also... Another pause, shorter this time. I think I also needed to see if someone was willing to stay. If someone would come up here and stay despite how hard it was. Eleanor stayed. He looked back at the pasture. Then she didn't have a choice about it. And then I thought maybe nobody would choose it again. Choose this place. Choose... He didn't finish that sentence. She waited. You stayed, he said. You've stayed through all of it, and you've made it worth staying for. He turned back to her. I don't know how to say that in a way that doesn't sound like too much or not enough. It sounds like the right amount, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with any production of it, just took it, the way you take something you've decided you're allowed to want. She let him, which was her own version of the same decision. They stood there in the dark for a while, not talking, looking at a pasture they couldn't see. Inside, Mabel was at the kitchen door, waiting with her characteristic patient authority for someone to remember her. The kitchen was dark, and the house was quiet, and 30 days was the number in everyone's head, but 30 days was also time, and time was the thing Abigail had always known how to use. She would get the legal read on the collateral document. She would find out about George Paulson's original agreement. She would go back through every record she had and look for the things she'd missed, because there was always one more thing, and finding it was just a matter of looking long enough. But first she went inside and let Mabel in, because some loyalties were simple, and simple loyalties deserved to be honored. The legal read came back in 4 days. Abigail had sent the document to a lawyer in the county seat, a woman named Harriet Pell, who Dottie had mentioned once in passing as someone who handled property disputes and didn't scare easily. She'd written to Harriet the morning after the feast, enclosing a copy of the collateral clause and a summary of the bank board inquiry's current status. and she'd waited with the particular patience of someone who knows that rushing this kind of thing produces errors. Harriet's response arrived on a Thursday. Abigail read it at the kitchen table before anyone else was up, with her coffee going cold beside her because she forgot to drink it. The analysis was careful and thorough, and it confirmed what she'd argued at the feast, that the collateral clause as written required bank board confirmation before it could be independently triggered, and that the current inquiry suspended that condition. But Harriet had found something additional that Abigail had not seen herself, which was a precedent case from 12 years prior in a neighboring county involving a nearly identical collateral structure, in which a judge had ruled that any collateral seizure conducted before bank board confirmation was not merely suspended but void, meaning it could be retroactively invalidated if the underlying debt was later found to be fraudulent. She read that paragraph 3 times. If George Paulson's original agreement had the same clause language, and she suspected strongly that it did, because Voss's operation had the character of a system, and systems used consistent documents, then the seizure of the cattle operation 2 years ago had not been legally valid. George's cattle, his land, taken through a collateral clause that could not have been properly triggered until the bank board confirmed a debt that the bank board had never actually reviewed. She sat with this for a long time. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the early summer morning was doing what early summer mornings did on the ridge, filling up slowly with light, the mountain holding the dark a little longer than the valley below. Then she got up and started breakfast, because the day had to happen regardless of what she'd just found, and because thinking while her hands were occupied had always been how she worked best. George came on Saturday with his tin box, the same one she'd seen on his brother-in-law's kitchen table in December. He sat across from her at the Blackwell kitchen table, and they went through his original collateral agreement together, side by side with Ronan's, side by side with Harriet Pell's analysis. The clause language was not identical. It was close, very close, but there was a difference in the third paragraph. The George's agreement specified bank board confirmation was required before any collateral action could be initiated, where Ronan's used the word conducted. The distinction mattered legally, Harriet had explained, because initiated was a broader protection than conducted. It meant even starting the process required confirmation, not just completing it. George's agreement was, on this point, actually stronger than Ronan's. He sat across from her and read the relevant paragraph twice. His face went through several things. She watched it and didn't rush him. He didn't have the right, George said finally. It wasn't a question. Based on this clause and the precedent Harriet found, no, he didn't. She kept her voice level. George, I want to be clear that this would require a formal legal challenge. It's not automatic. You'd need to bring a case, and it would take time, and Voss will fight it. He took my cattle, George said. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not anger exactly, but something beneath anger, something older and more fundamental, the bedrock feeling of a man who'd carried an injustice for 2 years and had just found out the weight of it was real, was confirmed, was not in his imagination. He took everything I built. He sat across from me and told me the numbers were clear when they weren't, and then he used a clause he wasn't allowed to use. He stopped, looked at his hands. My wife worked that operation with me for 8 years. 8 years. And she let him stop. She didn't fill the silence with comfort, because comfort wasn't what the moment needed. The moment needed to be what it was. After a while he said, "What do I do?" "You write to Harriet Pell," she said. "Today, if you can. You send her your original documents. These ones, certified copies, keep the originals. You let her assess the strength of the case." She paused. "And you let me add your situation to what I'm building for the bank board. Because if the board is investigating Voss's practices, if they see a pattern that includes not just fraudulent interest calculations, but also illegal collateral seizures, the scope of what they're looking at changes significantly." George looked at her. "You're building a case that's bigger than just Ronan's ranch." "I think it always was," she said. "I think from the beginning, the only way to stop this was to show the full shape of it, not just one family's bad account, the whole system." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My wife always said that the people who get away with things get away with them because everyone they hurt thinks they're the only one." He looked at the documents on the table. "She was right." "She was," Abigail said. "Well, She sent her compiled materials to the county bank board the following Monday. Everything she'd built over 8 months, organized into a document that ran to 40 pages and covered 6 specific cases of what she now understood as a coordinated scheme: fraudulent interest manipulation, premature collateral seizure using clause language Voss's own agreements didn't legally permit, and systematic exploitation of the valley's geographic and economic isolation to prevent any individual victim from seeing the full picture. Ronan signed the cover letter. So did George Paulson, Marcus Calhoun, and Thomas Henderson, whose signature arrived by post from 2 counties south, neat and deliberate on the page. She'd expected to feel something dramatic when she sent it: relief, or fear, or the particular weight of something important leaving your hands. Instead, she felt mostly tired and slightly hungry, and aware that the upper pasture fence line needed attention before the summer heat dried the ground too hard for post-setting. Some things did not wait for your emotional schedule. Ronan came into the kitchen that evening and found her mending a tear in one of the work shirts she'd started doing along with her own because it needed doing and no one else was doing it. He sat down across from her. "It's sent," he said. "Yes?" "How long does the board take to respond?" Harriet thinks 6 to 8 weeks for an initial finding, longer for a full ruling. She worked the needle through the fabric. The 30-day clock Voss set doesn't matter legally. We've established that, but he may try other pressure while the board considers things. "Let him try," Ronan said. He said it quietly, without bravado, which made it mean more than if he'd said it loudly. She looked up from the mending. He was watching her with the expression she'd seen more frequently in the weeks since the feast, more open than his usual contained look, as if something had been resolved in him that had been unresolved for a long time. She thought it was probably grief, or the particular phase of grief where you finally accept that living forward is not a betrayal of what was lost. She thought about Eleanor sometimes, not with jealousy, that would have been a strange and pointless feeling, but with a kind of respect for a woman she'd never met, who had built something worth grieving this thoroughly. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "Eleanor, did she know about the accounts? About Voss?" Ronan was quiet for a moment. "She knew we owed him. She knew the debt was growing in ways that didn't make sense. He paused. "She was sick the last year. She didn't have the energy to go through the numbers the way she would have otherwise." He looked at the table. "I've thought about that. Whether she knew something was wrong and didn't tell me because she didn't want me to worry while she was—" He stopped. "You don't have to answer that." "No, I think she knew something was off. She said once, near the end, that I should watch the accounts carefully after she was gone. Watch them carefully and don't take anyone's word for what they said." He was quiet. "I didn't do that. Not well enough. Not until you." Abigail set down the mending. "She told you what to do," she said, "and you found someone who knew how to do it. That's not failure, Ronan. That's how things actually work. Nobody does any of it alone." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "I suppose they don't." The bank board's initial finding came in 7 weeks, which was faster than Harriet had projected. It was a formal document, dense with legal language, but its substance was clear. The board had found sufficient evidence of systematic malpractice in Voss's lending operation to warrant a full investigation, had appointed an independent examiner, and had suspended all outstanding collateral actions associated with accounts under review pending the investigation's conclusion. All outstanding collateral actions. Not just Ronan's, all of them. Marcus Calhoun came up to the ridge when the news traveled, which it did within 2 days. He arrived on a Tuesday evening and sat at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands, and he said, "My father's name is in that board document, as a case under review." "I know," Abigail said. "It won't bring the pasture back." He looked at his hat. "I know that. The land was sold and it's gone, but it says—" He stopped. "It says that what happened to my father was wrong. Officially, formally." He looked up. "That matters." I didn't know how much it would matter until I read it. She understood what he meant. There is a particular weight that comes from being wronged and having no one in authority acknowledge it. A grinding, private weight that sits below everything else and alters the quality of daily life in ways you stop noticing because you've gotten used to carrying it. Having that wrong named, formally, by people with the authority to name it, it doesn't restore what was lost, but it changes the quality of the loss. It makes it something that happened to you rather than something that was simply your life. She had felt it herself, she realized, when the board document arrived, felt something she hadn't known she was waiting for. George Paulson's case was listed too. He would have a legal path now, not a guaranteed outcome, but a path, real and actionable, towards some form of restitution for what had been taken through a clause that had never been legally triggerable. Harriet Pell was already preparing the filing. Silas Voss's operation did not collapse overnight. That was not how these things worked, and she had known it wouldn't be. What happened instead was a sequence of smaller collapses, each one following from the one before, the way a structure goes when you remove the foundational piece. Not a single dramatic fall, but a progressive failure, section by section, as the weight that had been resting on the fraud had nowhere left to rest. The bank board's full investigation took 4 months. During those 4 months, the independent examiner reviewed accounts going back 12 years. He found the clerk Hester, who turned out to have kept meticulous personal records of every adjustment he'd made to every account at Voss's direction. Records kept, Hester explained when questioned, because he had always been afraid of what would happen if Voss turned on him, and he had nothing to defend himself with. Those records were the most detailed documentation of the fraud that anyone could have assembled, and they came not from Abigail's careful accounting, but from the fear of a small man who had been used by a larger one. That was the thing she hadn't seen coming. You build your case from what you can find, and sometimes what breaks it open is something you would never have thought to look for. Silas Voss was formally censured by the bank board in October. His lending operations license was revoked. 3 specific accounts, including Ronan's, were ruled fraudulent in their current form, and the outstanding debts were recalculated from the original agreed terms, a process that reduced Ronan's actual legal obligation by 31%. The collateral clause triggering in George Paulson's case was ruled invalid. The legal process for restitution began, and while it would take another year to resolve, and the cattle operation could not be reconstructed, there was a settlement that was not nothing. Voss did not go to prison. This was the part that sat uneasy with her, and she was honest with herself about it, sitting uneasy. The legal system in that county was what it was: imperfect, slow, weighted by the same social structures that had let the fraud persist for over a decade. Criminal charges were discussed and then not pursued for reasons that had more to do with who Voss knew in the county seat than with what he had actually done. He retained some of his property and a reduced version of his business interests. She had wanted something cleaner. She had wanted him to lose everything the way his victims had lost everything, and that had not happened, and she sat with the dissatisfaction of that for a while without pretending it was fine. But his power in the valley was gone. And power, she had come to understand, was the thing that had made the fraud possible. The way his reach into every corner of the local economy had prevented any single person from seeing the whole picture, had kept every victim isolated in their particular loss. Without that power, what remained was just a man with a diminished business and a reputation that the valley would not forget. That was not nothing either. She and Ronan talked about the partnership on a September evening, 6 weeks after the bank board ruling, sitting on the porch in the last of the summer heat, with coffee going cold on the rail between them. He'd been thinking about it for a while. She could tell by the way he approached it, with the careful deliberateness of someone who has rehearsed the words and then decided to say something different anyway. "The ranch doesn't make sense as just a ranch anymore," he said. "Not with what you've built here. The kitchen garden, the egg operation, the way people come up here now." It was true that people came. Dottie came regularly and brought others. Marcus Calhoun had been up twice since the board ruling. Neighbors she hadn't known in October were people she knew by name now, people who sat at her kitchen table and ate what she'd made and talked about what was growing and what wasn't and what they were trying to figure out. The kitchen had become a kind of center, not officially, not deliberately, just because that's what happens when a place produces good food and receives people without agenda. "What are you thinking?" she said. "I'm thinking the upper field produces more grain than we can use alone. I'm thinking the kitchen operation is larger than one person working it. I'm thinking—" He stopped, and she could see him deciding to just say it. "I'm thinking you have built something here that is yours as much as mine, and I would like the legal and practical arrangement to reflect that." She looked at him. "You're offering me a partnership. Equal shares, your name on the property documents, decision-making on both sides. He looked at his coffee. I've talked to Harriet Pell about the legal structure. It's straightforward. When did you talk to Harriet? 3 weeks ago. He had the expression of a man who knows he jumped ahead and isn't fully apologetic about it. I wanted to know it was actually possible before I offered it. She thought about what it meant to have your name on a piece of land. She had grown up without property, had moved through her adult life without the particular stability of a place that was legally, formally hers. She had not let herself want it, not specifically, not as a thing she could name, because wanting specific things that were out of reach was not a habit she could afford. The thing was, it wasn't out of reach anymore. There's something else I want to talk about, Ronan said. He said it to his coffee rather than to her, which she'd learned meant the thing being said was harder. Say it, she said. I've been trying to figure out how to say that I... He stopped. Tried again. When Eleanor died, I thought that was it. That was the last time I would have the kind of... Another stop. I'm not comparing. I'm not saying it's the same. It's not. But He finally looked at her directly. I would like more than a business partnership, Abigail. If that's something you're... He stopped, looking almost frustrated with himself. I'm not saying it right. You're saying it fine, she said. I'm saying it terribly. You're saying you'd like this to be something, she said. Between us, beyond the ranch. Yes, he said, simply, finally. She looked at the valley below the ridge, visible in the last light. The spread of land she'd come to know, the way you know a place you've worked in every season, where you know which pasture floods first and which fence line always needs the same post replaced, and which direction the afternoon wind comes from in August. She'd come here with 2 bags and 9 broken chickens and 60 cents less than $3. And she'd built, not alone, never alone, but built, something she hadn't known she was capable of building. I'd like that too, she said. He reached over and took her hand, the same way he had in the dark after the feast, without production, without drama. Just a decision made and acted on. They sat on the porch until the light was gone. They opened Whitmore and Blackwell's summer table the following June. It was not what Abigail had planned. She had not planned it at all, in fact. What happened was that enough people had been coming to the ranch kitchen over the fall and winter that Dottie, with her characteristic directness, said one evening in February that what was happening informally should be made formal, and several people around the table that evening agreed, and the agreement took on its own momentum before Abigail had fully decided how she felt about it. The supper house was built into the east side of the property, using the old storage building as a frame, extended and repaired and opened up, with a kitchen that was large enough to work properly, and a dining room that held 30 people if they didn't mind being close, which most people didn't mind when the food was good. The construction happened over 3 months, with Eli running the crew, which was the right decision. He had a gift for it she hadn't fully seen until she watched him organize other people, that quality of steadiness that made workers trust direction without resentment. Walt, who was not a sentimental man and would have been offended to be told he'd become one, showed up every weekend of the construction without being asked and worked without complaint and ate whatever was put in front of him, which was his way of saying that he was invested in how this turned out. Curtis built the sign. He was not, by his own admission, a craftsman. The letters were slightly uneven, and the paint was a color that Dottie said was more yellow than gold, which was what Curtis had been aiming for. But it hung above the door, and it said what it said. Whitmore and Blackwell's summer table. And the slight unevenness of it gave it a quality that a perfect sign would not have had. Abigail looked at it on the morning of the opening and felt something she couldn't entirely name. Not triumph. Triumph was too sharp and too brief. Something steadier. The feeling of a person looking at a thing that exists in the world where before it did not, knowing that the gap between those two states was filled with work and stubbornness and help from people she hadn't known a year and a half ago. Mabel was in the yard that morning, moving through her domain with the composed authority of a hen who has never once doubted her own importance. The 9 chickens, still 9, still intact as a flock, though the rooster they'd added in the spring had changed the social dynamics in ways that Mabel was managing with characteristic firmness, were a fixture of the property now. Visitors asked about them before they'd been there 5 minutes. Children came specifically to see Mabel, who received this attention as her due. The story of the 9 chickens had traveled in the way that certain stories travel in small communities, becoming more than the sum of its facts, accumulating the weight of what people wanted it to mean. She didn't fully control what it meant to other people, and she'd had to make her peace with that. What it meant to her was more specific and less symbolic, that you could look at a broken thing and see correctly whether it was actually broken or only in need of different conditions, and that the ability to see that difference was worth more than any amount of money or status or approval from people who decided before looking. The opening dinner was full. Every table, every chair, some people standing at the edges because they'd come and there wasn't room, but they stayed anyway. George Paulson was there, looking more like himself than she'd seen him yet. His brother-in-law's family around him, his children eating the food she'd made. Thomas Henderson had come back to the valley for the occasion, which she hadn't expected and which moved her more than she let show. Marcus Calhoun brought his sister, who had brought food to contribute before Abigail could say she didn't need to, and the contribution went on the table because it was good and there was room. Walt sat at the end of the table nearest the kitchen and ate everything placed in front of him and said nothing complimentary, which was exactly right. Eli waited tables with a teenage boy from one of the valley homesteads he'd befriended over the winter, and he moved through the room with the ease of someone who had found, unexpectedly, that he was good at hospitality, at making people comfortable, at the particular skill of reading a room and knowing what each part of it needed. She watched him work and thought about a young man who'd arrived at the Blackwell Ranch with nowhere else to go, and who was now, quietly, building a place to be. Ronan sat at the table nearest the window and talked to people, which was not something she would have predicted for him a year and a half ago. He was not transformed to he was still contained, still deliberate, still the kind of man whose silences were long and whose observations were spare. But the particular closing down that she'd seen in October, the quality of a man who had decided the world outside the ranch had nothing to offer, had opened up, degree by degree, the way things open when you give them enough time and the right conditions. She brought food out herself. She hadn't planned to. There was enough staff, but she wanted to, and she had learned over the past year and a half to do things she wanted to do when she wanted to do them, because not doing them didn't make her more professional or more modest. It just meant things went undone. Dottie caught her arm as she passed. "How does it feel?" Abigail looked around the room, at the full tables and the noise of people and the food going out and the light from the windows and the sign above the door that said her name alongside his. At all of it together, which was more than any single part. "Honest," she said, and meant it. Dottie looked at her. "Honest? It feels honest." She thought about how to explain it. "I spent most of my life being in places where I had to be smaller than I was, where the right thing to do was to take up less room and ask for less and want less and be glad of what I was given." She looked at the room again. "This is the first place I've built to the actual size of what I am, and it feels honest, like living at the right scale." Dottie looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "That's the most I've ever heard you say about yourself." "I know," Abigail said. "I'm working on saying more." She thought often, in the months that followed, about what it actually takes to build a life from the materials other people have discarded. Not in an abstract way, in a concrete, operational way. What it actually requires, step by step, so someone else could follow the sequence if they needed to. What it requires is this. First, you have to see correctly. You have to look at what's in front of you without the filter of what other people have already decided about it, which is harder than it sounds, because other people's decisions are loud and persistent, and they have been doing their work on you since before you were old enough to notice. You have to look and see what is actually there, separate from what everyone has said is there. Then you have to decide to act on what you've seen, not because it's safe, it's usually not, and not because success is guaranteed. It isn't. But because not acting when you've seen something correctly is its own kind of cost, and you have to be clear-eyed about that cost, rather than convincing yourself that the safer choice is actually free. Then you have to do the work. There is no version of this that doesn't include the work. The long evenings with the account ledgers, the cold mornings on barn roofs, the conversations with frightened people that you have to have whether you feel like it or not. The bread that comes out too dark on the bottom because you got distracted. The fence post that needs setting when you'd rather be doing something else. The work is not romantic, and it is not optional, and it is not something other people can do for you. And then, This is the part she had learned most recently, the part she had been worst at for longest. You have to let people help. You have to receive what they offer. Walt's steadiness, Eli's repairs, Dottie's network, George Paulson's courage, Ronan's hand in the dark, and a cup of coffee set on a counter without a word. All the forms that other people's help takes, which are not always the forms you expect or prefer. She had thought for a long time that receiving help was a kind of weakness, that the measure of a person was what they could accomplish alone. She had learned, slowly and with some resistance, that this was wrong, not just impractical, but wrong as a way of thinking about human beings, who are not designed for alone, who function best in the particular friction and warmth of being known by other people. You could not build a community from isolation. You could not build anything lasting from isolation. The thing she'd built had been built from 9 broken chickens, and Ronan's trust and Walt's loyalty, and Dottie's directness, and the courage of 3 men who stood up in a county hearing room and said what had happened to them. None of those pieces alone would have been enough. All of them together had changed a valley. The summer rolled on. The supper house did well, not spectacular, not the kind of success that makes people's eyes go wide, but the solid, sustainable kind that comes from doing a thing properly and letting reputation travel at its own pace. Travelers came through the valley on the Ridge Road and stopped because of what they'd heard. People from neighboring counties made the journey specifically. A correspondent for a regional paper wrote a piece about the Blackwell chickens, which caused a brief surge in visitors that leveled off after 6 weeks into a steady flow that the kitchen could manage. Abigail and Ronan were married in October. A small ceremony, just the ranch family and the closest neighbors, because neither of them wanted anything larger and neither felt any need to justify that preference. Eli stood up for Ronan, which made the young man's face do something complicated and careful before he composed himself. Dottie stood up for Abigail and cried, which surprised them both, and then looked annoyed at herself for crying, which was very Dottie. Walt gave a toast that was 4 sentences long and was the best toast anyone gave, because it was specific and it was true and it didn't try to be more than it was. George Paulson's restitution case concluded the following spring. The settlement was not everything that had been taken. It couldn't be, because the cattle operation no longer existed and the years of lost income couldn't be calculated with precision. But it was substantial enough that George could start over on a smaller scale, which he did, buying a modest plot in the valley's eastern end and building a different kind of operation than the one he'd lost. He came to the summer table for dinner the night the settlement was finalized, and he sat at the corner table by the window and ate 2 full plates and drank his coffee slowly and didn't say much. And Abigail refilled his cup once without being asked, and otherwise left him to it, which was what he needed. Silas Voss left the valley eventually. Not driven out, there was no dramatic departure, no confrontation at the county line. He simply became smaller and smaller in the valley's awareness until one season he was gone, relocated to somewhere else, and the valley adjusted to his absence the way a body adjusts to the removal of something that had been causing low-grade pain for so long it had started to seem normal. The adjustment took some time. Freedoms you've been without for a decade don't feel like freedoms immediately. They feel like unfamiliar space, which takes getting used to. Mabel died the following autumn, which was a thing that Abigail had known was coming and had not fully prepared for anyway. She died as she had lived, without drama, in the middle of an ordinary day, simply there and then, not there. Abigail found her in the coop and sat with her for a while before telling anyone, which was a private and slightly embarrassing thing to do, and which she did without apology. She buried her near the kitchen garden, because Mabel had spent more hours near that garden than anywhere else, and because Abigail had always thought the garden was partly Mabel's too, in the way that certain places belong to the presences that have most consistently occupied them. Ronan found her there afterward, sitting on the ground near the garden. He sat down beside her without asking why she was sitting on the ground, which was one of many things she valued about him. She was a remarkable bird, he said. She was, Abigail said. For a chicken. For anything, she said. He didn't argue with this. They sat for a while on the ground near the kitchen garden, and the mountain did what mountains did in autumn, which was to make the air very clear and very cold and very honest. The other 8 were still in the yard. The rooster was attempting something unrelated and undignified. The valley below was turning the colors of the season. The sign above the supper house door caught the afternoon light, the slightly uneven letters that Curtis had painted that were more yellow than gold. Whitmore and Blackwell's summer table. She thought about a woman who had walked into a town with 2 bags and high hopes and no particular reason for anyone to believe in her, who had stood in a yard at an auction and bought something broken because she could see it wasn't actually broken. She thought about all the places she had been smaller than she was, and all the ways she had been told, directly and indirectly, loudly and quietly, that the things she valued in herself were not things worth valuing. She thought about what it cost to hold on to yourself anyway, not to harden against the world. Hardening is its own kind of loss. But to stay soft enough to let things in while remaining, underneath, specifically and stubbornly, yourself. That balance is not natural. It doesn't come for free. It requires the same kind of daily work as the garden and the accounts and the fence lines. Consistent, unglamorous, necessary. She had done it imperfectly. She still did. She lost patience sometimes and said things wrong. She misjudged people occasionally. She had been so focused on fighting Voss's fraud that she'd almost missed the collateral clause, which could have cost them everything. She was not, had never been, would never be the clean and certain version of herself that people sometimes seem to want her to be. But she was here. Her name was on the door, and her name was on the land, and the people inside the supper house on any given evening were people she knew and who knew her, and that had not been true a year and a half ago. And the distance between then and now was not luck, and it was not fate, and it was not the operation of any force larger than human stubbornness and human connection, and the willingness to look at a broken thing and ask the only question that had ever mattered to her. Not is it broken, not is it worth fixing, but simply, what does it actually need? The answer, always, turned out to be less dramatic than people expected. Time. Correct conditions. Someone willing to pay attention. Someone willing to stay. Ronan stood up and held out his hand, and she took it and stood up, and they went inside where it was warm and there was food, and the evening was beginning, and the people who had become their people were already arriving at the door.